In the heart of Gotham City, when darkness falls and honest citizens lock their doors, one figure emerges from shadows deeper than any nightmare. Before the cape, before the cowl, before the legend that would make criminals whisper prayers in back alleys, there lived a boy who believed the world was safe. His name was Bruce Wayne, and he was 8 years old when everything changed. Picture, if you will, a grand theater on a warm October evening in 1981. The Monarch Theater on Park Row buzzed with elegant conversation as Gotham's elite gathered for an evening of culture. Among them sat the Wayne family, Thomas and Martha Wayne with their son Bruce between them, watching a swashbuckling adventure unfold on stage. The Mark of Zorro played out its tale of a masked hero fighting injustice, and young Bruce watched with wide eyes, completely captivated. Thomas Wayne, Gotham's most prominent physician and philanthropist, smiled as he watched his son's fascination with the heroic Zorro. Martha Wayne, radiant in her pearl necklace, whispered quietly about the performance to Bruce, her voice warm with motherly love. This was their tradition, these family outings to the theater, these moments of shared wonder and togetherness. But legends are not born from happiness. They are forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss. Before we begin this journey together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's adventure into Gotham's darkest secrets. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these explorations into the twisted corners of the DC universe. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing our global community come together for these stories. Now get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot. As the final curtain fell and the audience applauded, the Wayne family made their way toward the theater's exit. The night air was crisp, filled with the promise of changing seasons. Bruce walked between his parents, still buzzing with excitement about the masked hero he had just witnessed. He had no idea that within minutes, he would understand the terrible need for such heroes in the real world. Thomas Wayne made a decision that would echo through decades. Instead of waiting for their car in the theater's safe, well-lit lobby, he suggested they take a shortcut through Park Row's back alley. It was a decision born of innocence, of a good man's belief that his city was fundamentally safe, that evil was something that happened to other people in other places. Crime Alley, as it would later be known, was narrow and poorly lit. The sound of their footsteps echoed off brick walls covered in decades of Gotham's grime. Martha's heels clicked against wet pavement, and Bruce's small hand was warm in his father's strong grip. For a moment, they were just a family walking home together, protected by love and prosperity, and the naive belief that tragedy always happened to someone else. Then came the footsteps behind them. Quicker than theirs, desperate, hungry. A figure emerged from the shadows, face gaunt with desperation, eyes wild with the kind of need that makes men do unthinkable things. Joe Chill had been unemployed for months. His family was hungry. The city's economic downturn had crushed him like it had crushed so many others. In his trembling hand he held a gun that felt heavier than his conscience. "Your money." Chill's voice cracked as he pointed the weapon at Thomas Wayne. "Just give me your wallet." Thomas Wayne, even facing a gun, remained calm. He was a doctor, a healer, a man who had spent his life helping others. "Of course," he said gently, reaching slowly into his jacket. "There's no need for violence." But Martha Wayne gasped when she saw the gun. Her hand instinctively went to her pearl necklace, the precious family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. The motion startled the desperate gunman. His finger twitched on the trigger, and in an instant that lasted forever, 2 shots rang out through the narrow alley. Thomas Wayne fell first, his final breath a whispered "Martha." Martha Wayne crumpled beside him, her pearls scattering across the dirty pavement like fallen stars, each one catching what little light filtered into that cursed alley. The gunman, horrified by what he had done, fled into the night, leaving behind his gun and 3 lives forever changed. Young Bruce Wayne stood frozen in that alley, watching his parents' blood pool on the cold ground, their lifeless eyes staring at nothing. The boy who had just watched a hero triumph over evil now faced a truth that would reshape his very soul. There are no heroes coming to save you. There is no justice unless you create it yourself. There is no safety unless you become strong enough to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, but for Bruce Wayne, help would always arrive too late. As Detective Jim Gordon knelt beside the traumatized boy and gently placed a coat around his trembling shoulders, Bruce made a promise that would echo through the decades to come. But here, in this moment where our tale truly begins, something else stirred in that alley. Something the police reports would never record. Something the newspapers would never print. As young Bruce knelt beside his parents' bodies, as their blood seeped into Gotham's indifferent pavement, the city itself seemed to shudder. The very shadows grew deeper, the darkness more complete. Gotham City, you see, has a way of creating the protectors it needs. And on that October night, witnessing the birth of its greatest guardian, even the gargoyles atop the surrounding buildings seemed to lean forward with anticipation. Because this was not just the death of Thomas and Martha Wayne, this was not simply the orphaning of young Bruce. This was the moment when Gotham's darkness finally found its match, when the night itself would soon take human form and learn to strike fear into the hearts of those who prey upon the innocent. The boy who walked into that alley believing in safety and justice walked out, knowing that both must be earned through vigilance and strength. And though he did not know it yet, though the cape and cowl were still years away, Bruce Wayne had just taken his first step toward becoming something more than human. He had just begun his journey toward becoming Batman. But that transformation would not come easily, and the price he would pay for his mission would be measured not just in his own sacrifice, but in the lives of everyone who would choose to stand beside him in the war that was about to begin. The Wayne family fortune was built on more than money. For 6 generations, the Wayne name had stood for something precious in Gotham City. Thomas Wayne, the patriarch who fell in Crime Alley, had dedicated his life to healing both bodies and souls. As chief of surgery at Gotham General Hospital, he saved lives by day. As a philanthropist by night, he funded free clinics, homeless shelters, and educational programs that lifted entire neighborhoods out of poverty. Martha Wayne, born Martha Kane, brought her own legacy of compassion to the family. Her Kane family had been Gotham's cultural cornerstone for decades, funding museums, libraries, and the very theater where their lives would end. Together, Thomas and Martha Wayne represented everything bright and beautiful about Gotham's potential. They believed, with the innocent faith of good people, that wealth carried with it the responsibility to heal the world. Bruce Wayne grew up in this atmosphere of privilege tempered by purpose. Wayne Manor, perched on the hills overlooking Gotham, was not merely a mansion, but a beacon of what the city could become. The sprawling estate housed not just the Wayne family, but also served as a gathering place for charity events, community meetings, and cultural celebrations. Young Bruce knew every secret passage in the ancient manor, every hidden alcove and forgotten room, never dreaming that one day these shadows would serve a very different purpose. Alfred Pennyworth, the Wayne family butler, had been more than a servant, a former British intelligence operative who had found peace in domestic service. Alfred had watched Bruce grow from a curious toddler into a thoughtful child who asked endless questions about justice and fairness. Even at 8 years old, Bruce displayed an unusual sensitivity to suffering. He would insist on donating his toys to charity drives, would ask his father why some people lived in the grand houses of Gotham Heights, while others slept in the alleys of the Narrows. Thomas Wayne would answer these questions patiently, explaining that the world was complicated but fundamentally good, that people like the Wayne family had a duty to help those less fortunate, that with enough compassion and effort, even a city like Gotham could be healed of its pain. He spoke of Gotham as a patient that needed care, not judgment, treatment rather than condemnation. But beneath Gotham's gleaming surface, forces of corruption had been growing for decades. The Falcone crime family, led by Carmine the Roman Falcone, had woven their influence through every level of city government. Police commissioners took their orders from mob bosses. Judges ruled according to who paid their bribes. Even some doctors and hospital administrators looked the other way when criminals needed medical care without questions asked. Thomas Wayne remained largely unaware of this shadow empire. His wealth and status insulated him from Gotham's darker realities. When he drove through the East End to volunteer at free clinics, he saw poverty and desperation, but he interpreted these as social problems to be solved through education and economic opportunity. He never imagined that organized crime had deliberately cultivated desperation as a tool for recruitment and control. The economic recession that gripped Gotham in the early 1980s created the perfect storm of circumstances. Unemployment soared, small businesses closed, families who had been stable middle class found themselves choosing between rent and food. The city's social services, underfunded due to corruption and mismanagement, collapsed under the weight of increasing need. Into this environment of desperation stepped men like Joe Chill, a former factory worker with a wife and young daughter. Chill had been laid off when Wayne Enterprises closed one of its smaller manufacturing plants as part of a modernization effort. The irony was bitter. The Wayne family's business decision, made from the best intentions to keep the company competitive and preserve more jobs in the long run, had directly contributed to the desperation that would destroy them. Chill had tried everything. He had applied for every available job. He had swallowed his pride and asked for help from charities, including Wayne Foundation programs. But charity was not enough to feed a family indefinitely, and the waiting lists for social services stretched for months. Each passing day brought him closer to the edge of desperation where rational thinking gives way to desperate action. On the night of October 1st, Joe Chill had not planned to become a killer. He had planned a simple robbery. The Wayne family, dressed in their elegant theater attire, represented everything he had lost: security, prosperity, hope for the future. The gun in his hand, purchased on the black market with the last of his savings, was supposed to be a tool of intimidation, nothing more. But desperation is a poison that clouds judgment and steady hands. When Martha Wayne gasped at the sight of the weapon, when her hand moved toward her necklace in a gesture that Chill misinterpreted as reaching for something threatening, panic overrode reason. The first shot was fired in fear. The second followed in the terrible momentum of violence once unleashed. In those few seconds, 3 lives were destroyed completely, and a 4th was transformed beyond recognition. Thomas Wayne died still believing in Gotham's fundamental goodness. Martha Wayne died clutching pearls that had been worn by Kane women for generations. Joe Chill fled into the night, carrying guilt that would eventually drive him to confess his crime years later. And Bruce Wayne, age 8, knelt in his parents' blood and felt something fundamental break inside his soul. The safe, rational world where problems could be solved through kindness and charity ceased to exist. In its place rose a darker understanding. Evil was real, immediate, and personal. It did not respond to reason or compassion. It could only be fought with equal commitment and superior preparation. Detective Jim Gordon, responding to reports of gunshots in Park Row, found the boy sitting perfectly still beside his parents' bodies. Gordon, himself one of the few honest cops in Gotham's corrupt police department, recognized immediately that he was looking at something more than a crime scene. This was a moment of transformation, a crossing point where innocence died and something else was born. As Gordon gently led Bruce away from the alley, the boy turned back once to look at the place where his parents had fallen. What he saw there would fuel nightmares for years to come, but it would also fuel something else, an absolute dedication to ensuring that no other child would have to experience what he had just endured. The newspapers the next morning would report the tragedy as a random street crime, another symptom of Gotham's growing urban decay. Police Commissioner Gillian Loeb, already on Falcone's payroll, made sure the investigation remained superficial. Joe Chill was never identified as the gunman, though his guilt would eventually surface through other means. But for Bruce Wayne, sitting in Wayne Manor's vast library while Alfred tried to comfort him with hot cocoa and quiet words, the investigation's failure only confirmed what he had learned in that alley. Justice would not come from others. Protection could not be trusted to institutions that were weak or corrupt. If the innocent were to be safe, if the weak were to be protected, if evil was to be stopped, it would require something that Gotham had never seen before. It would require someone willing to become more than human. Someone prepared to sacrifice everything personal and comfortable and safe in service of a mission that might never truly end. It would require someone willing to embrace the very darkness that had created him, to master it and turn it against itself. 8-year-old Bruce Wayne did not yet know that he would become Batman, but as he sat in that library, surrounded by books about history and justice and the eternal struggle between good and evil, he began to understand that his old life had ended in Crime Alley. What would emerge from that ending, what would rise from the ashes of his shattered innocence, would be something Gotham's criminals could not yet imagine. The boy who had believed in heroes was dead. In his place sat someone who would have to become the hero he had needed in that alley, the protector who had not come in time to save Thomas and Martha Wayne, but who might still save countless others from experiencing the same devastating loss. The transformation had begun, though its full scope would not be clear for many years to come. The funeral of Thomas and Martha Wayne drew thousands to Gotham Cathedral, every seat filled with mourners, every aisle lined with those who came to pay respects to two souls who had embodied hope in a city that desperately needed it. Bruce Wayne sat in the front pew, a small figure in a black suit too large for his frame, watching as his parents were eulogized by people who spoke of their kindness, their generosity, their unwavering belief in Gotham's potential for greatness. Alfred Pennyworth sat beside the boy, his own grief carefully controlled behind the composure expected of an English gentleman. The butler had loved Thomas and Martha Wayne not merely as employers, but as the family he had never had. Now he faced the daunting prospect of raising their son alone, of somehow filling the void left by two extraordinary people who had been taken far too soon. After the service, after the burial, after the last mourner had offered their condolences and departed, Bruce Wayne stood in the Wayne family cemetery behind the manor. The headstones of 6 generations of Waynes surrounded his parents' fresh graves, each one representing a life dedicated to improving Gotham through philanthropy, medicine, or civic leadership. But as Bruce stared at the freshly turned earth that covered his parents, he felt something crystallizing within his young mind that would have horrified Thomas and Martha Wayne. Their way had failed. Kindness had not protected them. Charity had not saved them. All their good works, all their noble intentions, all their faith in human nature had not prevented a desperate man from pulling a trigger twice in a filthy alley. The realization cut through Bruce's grief like a blade, sharp and clean and transformative. If he wanted to honor his parents' memory, if he wanted to prevent other families from suffering as he had suffered, he would need to find a different path. That night, Bruce Wayne knelt at his parents' graves and spoke words that would echo through decades of Gotham's history. His voice was steady, despite his age, carrying a conviction that seemed to emerge from some deep well within his soul. I swear by the spirits of my parents to avenge their deaths by spending the rest of my life warring on all criminals. The vow was more than words. It was a fundamental rewiring of his existence, a conscious decision to sacrifice everything that most people consider essential to happiness in service of a mission that might never end. Bruce Wayne, at 8 years old, had chosen to become something other than human. He simply did not yet know what form that transformation would take. Alfred found the boy there hours later, still kneeling in the cold October air. The butler's heart broke as he looked at the child who had aged years in the space of days, who carried himself with a gravity that no 8-year-old should possess. Alfred helped Bruce to his feet and guided him back to the manor, but he could see that something fundamental had changed. The boy who had run laughing through Wayne Manor's halls was gone, replaced by someone older, colder, more purposeful. The years that followed were unlike any childhood Alfred had ever witnessed. Bruce Wayne became a student in the truest sense, but his curriculum extended far beyond what any school could provide. He devoured books on criminology, psychology, forensic science, and martial arts. He studied the great detectives of literature and history, absorbing their methods and adapting their techniques to his own developing understanding of how criminal minds operated. By age 10, Bruce had read every case file in the Gotham Police Department's public records. By 12, he was corresponding with criminologists at universities across the country, asking probing questions about behavioral analysis and crime scene investigation. By 14, he had physically outgrown most boys his age through a rigorous training regimen that Alfred could barely keep pace with. The transformation was not merely intellectual or physical. Bruce Wayne developed an almost supernatural ability to compartmentalize emotion, to observe and analyze situations with clinical detachment, even when they involved violence or tragedy. He would read about murders, kidnappings, and assaults with the same focused attention that other teenagers brought to sports scores or movie reviews. Alfred watched this metamorphosis with growing concern. The boy he had helped raise was disappearing, replaced by someone who seemed to view human suffering as data to be processed rather than tragedies to be mourned. When Alfred tried to encourage normal childhood activities, Bruce would participate with polite compliance but obvious disinterest. His true passion lay in understanding the darkness that had claimed his parents, in preparing himself to confront it on terms that Thomas and Martha Wayne had never imagined. At 16, Bruce announced his intention to travel the world for advanced training. Alfred initially resisted, arguing that the boy needed stability and emotional healing more than he needed to learn new ways to fight criminals. But Bruce had already mapped out his journey with methodical precision. He would study with masters in Tibet, learning meditation techniques that would allow him to function without normal sleep patterns. He would train with martial artists in Japan, absorbing fighting styles that had been refined over centuries. He would work with escape artists in Europe, mastering techniques that could save his life if he were ever captured. Most importantly, he would learn from detectives and law enforcement professionals around the globe, studying investigative methods that went far beyond what any American police academy could teach. Bruce Wayne intended to become the greatest detective in human history, someone capable of solving crimes that would baffle ordinary investigators. The night before his departure, Bruce stood once again at his parents' graves. 17 years old now, tall and lean from years of physical training, he had grown into someone who bore little resemblance to the traumatized child who had knelt in this same spot years earlier. But the vow he had made remained unchanged, burned into his consciousness with the permanence of scar tissue. "I'm going to learn everything I need to know to keep my promise to you," he said quietly to the silent headstones. "When I come back, I'll be ready to make sure no other child has to stand where I'm standing." Alfred accompanied Bruce to the airport, his emotions carefully controlled behind decades of British training. As he watched the young man who had been his ward disappear into the international terminal, Alfred could not shake the feeling that Bruce Wayne was walking toward something that would consume whatever remained of the boy's humanity. The mission that had been born in Crime Alley demanded sacrifices that most people could never comprehend, and Alfred suspected that Bruce understood the price far better than he had ever admitted. Over the following years, Alfred received occasional letters from remote corners of the world. Bruce wrote from monasteries in the Himalayas, where he learned to push his body beyond normal human limitations through meditation and controlled breathing. He wrote from training camps in Asia, where masters who had devoted their lives to perfecting combat techniques agreed to teach a young American whose intensity impressed even hardened warriors. He wrote from police academies in Europe, where veteran investigators shared insights about criminal behavior that textbooks could never capture. He wrote from morgues and crime scenes, where he studied the aftermath of violence with the clinical interest of a surgeon examining diseased tissue. Each letter revealed a young man becoming more capable and more dangerous, but also more isolated from normal human experience. Bruce Wayne was systematically removing every weakness, every vulnerability, every emotional connection that might interfere with his mission. He was becoming a perfect instrument of justice, honed to razor sharpness and utterly dedicated to his purpose. But perfection came with a cost that would not become clear until years later, when Bruce Wayne returned to Gotham and discovered that the skills he had learned were only the beginning of his transformation. The boy who had sworn vengeance at his parents' graves was gone forever, replaced by someone who would soon discover that fighting monsters required becoming something monstrous in return. In a monastery high in the Himalayan peaks, Bruce Wayne meditated through frigid nights that would have killed lesser men. In ancient temples across Asia, he sparred with masters whose techniques had been passed down through generations of warriors. In European police stations, he analyzed crime scenes with veteran detectives who were amazed by his intuitive understanding of criminal psychology. But it was during a particularly brutal training session in a remote dojo in Japan that Bruce Wayne experienced the revelation that would define the rest of his life. His sensei, a master who had devoted 70 years to perfecting his art, defeated Bruce in combat so thoroughly that the young American found himself unconscious on the training mat for the second time in a week. As Bruce struggled to his feet, his sensei offered words that would echo through every choice Bruce made in the decades to come. "You fight with great skill," the old master said in carefully measured English, "but you fight like a man who seeks to defeat his enemies. To truly win, you must become something your enemies cannot understand, something that strikes fear into their hearts before the first blow is thrown. You must become more than human if you wish to protect those who are merely human." That night, alone in his simple quarters, Bruce Wayne understood that all his training, all his preparation, all his dedication to perfecting himself as a weapon against crime was still insufficient. He possessed the skills of a master detective, the fighting abilities of a warrior, the physical conditioning of an Olympic athlete, but criminals would see him as simply another man, another obstacle to overcome through superior numbers or firepower. He needed to become something else entirely, something that would make hardened killers flee in terror, something that would haunt the nightmares of those who preyed upon the innocent. He needed to transform himself into a symbol that transcended mere human limitation, a force of nature that criminals would fear even when he was not present. The idea that would eventually become Batman was born in that moment of clarity, though Bruce Wayne would not understand its full implications until he returned to Gotham and faced the realities of urban crime firsthand. For now, it was simply a recognition that his mission required him to become something unprecedented, something that had never existed in human history. As Bruce Wayne continued his global odyssey of training and preparation, he carried with him the growing certainty that the boy who had died in Crime Alley would be reborn as something far more dangerous than Thomas and Martha Wayne could ever have imagined. Their son was becoming a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen, forged in the fires of loss and tempered by years of relentless preparation. The gentle child who had once worried about homeless people in Gotham's alleys was being replaced by someone who would soon strike terror into the hearts of those who created homelessness through their crimes. But that transformation would demand sacrifices that Bruce Wayne was only beginning to understand, prices that would be paid not only by himself, but by everyone who would eventually choose to stand beside him in the war he was preparing to wage. 25-year-old Bruce Wayne returned to Gotham on a gray November morning, stepping off a private jet at Wayne Enterprises airfield. 7 years had transformed him from a traumatized teenager into something that even Alfred struggled to recognize. The young man who embraced his loyal butler possessed the lean, dangerous build of a professional athlete, eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that seemed to command attention without effort. Alfred noted immediately how Bruce moved differently now. Each step was calculated, each gesture economical. The boy who had once run impulsively through Wayne Manor's halls had been replaced by someone who approached every situation with methodical precision. Even simple conversations carried an undercurrent of intensity that made Alfred uncomfortably aware that he was speaking to someone who had spent years preparing for war. Bruce spent his first week back in Gotham studying the city that had shaped his destiny. Crime statistics showed that violence had increased dramatically during his absence. The Falcone crime family had expanded their operations, corrupting additional police precincts and extending their influence into previously legitimate businesses. Street crime flourished under the protection of bought judges and intimidated witnesses. The Gotham that had killed his parents had grown stronger while he had grown stronger, setting the stage for a confrontation that both sides had been preparing for without knowing it. Wayne Manor felt different now, its vast rooms and hidden passages taking on new significance as Bruce began to envision how they might serve his mission. The ancient butler's pantry could house surveillance equipment. The wine cellar could store specialized weapons and gear. The network of natural caves beneath the manor, which Bruce had explored as a child, could become a base of operations unlike anything law enforcement had ever imagined. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was fighting. Bruce Wayne, heir to billions, possessed resources that no vigilante in history had commanded. He could fund his war on crime indefinitely, equip himself with technology beyond anything criminals had encountered, and operate with a freedom that police departments constrained by budgets and regulations could never match. Yet resources meant nothing without intelligence, and intelligence required getting close to the enemy. Bruce began his real education in crime by walking Gotham's streets at night, not as a billionaire philanthropist but as someone who belonged in the shadows. He had learned during his travels how to move unseen through urban environments, how to observe without being observed, how to blend into crowds and disappear when necessary. These skills served him well as he began mapping Gotham's criminal ecosystem from the inside. In the East End, he witnessed drug dealers recruiting children barely into their teens, offering them more money in a week than their families saw in months. In the Diamond District, he observed corrupt police officers accepting payments from gambling operations that laundered money for larger criminal enterprises. In Crime Alley, where his parents had died, he watched predators stalking victims with the confidence of men who knew the law could not touch them. Each night brought fresh evidence that Gotham's criminal networks operated with virtual impunity. Traditional law enforcement had been systematically undermined through corruption, intimidation, and the simple mathematics of being outnumbered by criminals who faced no meaningful consequences for their actions. The handful of honest cops, like Detective Jim Gordon, were isolated voices crying out against a tide of institutionalized corruption that had been decades in the making. Bruce Wayne realized that conventional approaches to fighting crime would be worse than useless. A legitimate businessman working within the system would accomplish nothing against enemies who had captured the system itself. A vigilante operating like a traditional law enforcement officer would simply become another target for assassination or corruption. If he wanted to succeed where others had failed, he would need to become something that criminals had never encountered before. The breakthrough came during what should have been Bruce Wayne's first attempt at crime fighting. Armed with combat training that surpassed most special forces operators and equipped with gear that money could buy, he ventured into a warehouse district where the Falcone family stored drugs imported from Central America. His plan was methodical and thorough. Disable the guards, gather evidence of criminal activity, anonymously deliver that evidence to the few honest prosecutors remaining in Gotham's justice system. What he discovered instead was how naive his planning had been. The warehouse guards were not merely hired muscle but experienced killers who had survived gang wars across multiple cities. They operated with military discipline and firepower that matched anything Bruce had encountered during his training overseas. Within minutes of his attempted infiltration, Bruce Wayne found himself outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting for his life against men who felt no hesitation about killing a would-be hero. He barely escaped that first encounter, wounded and humiliated by how thoroughly his enemies had been prepared for exactly the kind of attack he had mounted. As Bruce limped back to Wayne Manor, his expensive gear torn and his body aching from injuries that could easily have been fatal, he confronted a harsh truth about his mission. Being Bruce Wayne, no matter how well-trained or well-equipped, would never be enough. Criminals could research Bruce Wayne, could learn his patterns and capabilities, could plan countermeasures against a man whose identity and resources were matters of public record. If he wanted to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies, if he wanted to operate with the element of surprise and psychological advantage, he needed to become someone else entirely. That night, sitting in Wayne Manor's study while Alfred tended his wounds, Bruce Wayne stared into the fireplace and tried to understand what kind of persona could succeed where Bruce Wayne had failed. His enemies were not impressed by wealth or social status. They respected only strength and feared only what they could not predict or control. He needed to become something that would haunt their nightmares, something that would make hardened killers flee rather than fight. The answer came in the form of a massive black bat that crashed through the study's tall windows, startling both Bruce and Alfred with its sudden appearance. The creature, likely seeking shelter from a brewing storm, perched on the back of Thomas Wayne's favorite reading chair and fixed Bruce with eyes that seemed to burn with predatory intelligence. In that moment, Bruce Wayne understood what he needed to become. Bats were creatures of the night, invisible until they chose to reveal themselves. They navigated by senses beyond normal human capability, could appear and disappear without warning, and inspired irrational fear in people who had no logical reason to be afraid of them. Most importantly, bats were associated with darkness, mystery, and death in the minds of criminals who had grown up with the same urban legends and superstitions as everyone else. A man dressed as a bat would be dismissed as a madman by anyone who heard about him secondhand. But criminals who encountered such a figure in person, especially if he possessed demonstrably superior combat skills and equipment, would face something their minds could not properly categorize. Was he human or something else? Was he one person or many? Could he be killed like a normal man, or would harming him bring supernatural consequences? The psychological advantage would be enormous, but only if Bruce Wayne could disappear completely behind the mask. Batman could not be someone Bruce Wayne pretended to be during nighttime hours. Batman would need to become the primary identity, with Bruce Wayne maintained as a necessary but secondary persona, used only when civilian cover was required. That transformation would demand sacrifices that Bruce was only beginning to understand. Batman could form no lasting relationships that might compromise his mission. Batman could trust no one completely, since trust created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. Batman would need to operate in a moral space beyond normal human limitations, prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect the innocent regardless of legal or ethical constraints that governed ordinary citizens. Alfred watched with growing alarm as Bruce Wayne spent the following weeks designing and creating the Batman persona with the same methodical precision he had brought to years of training. The young man who had returned from his travels barely resembled the boy Alfred had raised, but the person who emerged from Wayne Manor's basement workshop after creating the first Batman costume was someone else entirely. The cape was designed to spread like wings during falls or leaps, creating the silhouette of something larger than human. The cowl obscured facial features, while incorporating technology that enhanced night vision and hearing beyond natural limits. The armor beneath was flexible enough to allow full mobility while stopping bullets and bladed weapons. The utility belt contained tools and weapons that could handle any situation Bruce's tactical planning could envision. But the costume was only the beginning of the transformation. Bruce Wayne practiced moving like Batman until the persona became as natural as breathing. He modified his voice, his posture, his entire physical presence to create someone who bore no resemblance to the billionaire philanthropist that Gotham society knew. When Alfred first saw the complete Batman in action, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in Wayne Manor's caves. This was not Bruce Wayne playing dress-up. This was the birth of something that transcended human limitation, something that had been forged in the fires of tragedy and shaped by years of preparation into a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. The boy who had knelt at his parents' graves and sworn an oath of vengeance had kept his promise in ways that Thomas and Martha Wayne could never have imagined. On a cold December night, Batman emerged from the shadows of Gotham's warehouse district to confront the same criminal organization that had nearly killed Bruce Wayne weeks earlier. But the men who had easily defeated a wealthy amateur found themselves facing something that defied their understanding of what was possible. Batman moved through their defenses like smoke, appearing and disappearing before they could target him effectively. Their bullets struck empty air while his attacks found their mark with surgical precision. When the survivors fled into the night, they carried with them stories that would spread through Gotham's criminal underground like a virus, growing more frightening with each retelling. The war that Bruce Wayne had declared at his parents' graves had finally begun, and Gotham's criminals were about to discover that they faced an enemy unlike anything in their nightmares. Batman was loose in their city, and nothing would ever be the same again. Within 6 months of Batman's first appearance, Gotham City's criminal landscape underwent a transformation that defied every prediction law enforcement experts had made about urban crime patterns. Traditional criminals who had operated with impunity for decades suddenly found themselves looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, and abandoning operations they had considered completely secure. The stories that spread through the underworld grew more elaborate with each telling, but they all centered on the same terrifying truth: something was hunting them. Commissioner Gillian Loeb, thoroughly corrupt and comfortably in the pocket of the Falcone crime family, initially dismissed reports of a masked vigilante as the desperate fantasies of criminals looking for excuses to explain their failures. But as evidence mounted and witness accounts became impossible to ignore, even Loeb began to understand that Gotham faced something unprecedented. The criminals who survived encounters with Batman described someone who moved like smoke, struck like lightning, and seemed to possess knowledge about their operations that should have been impossible for any outsider to obtain. Detective Jim Gordon, one of the few honest cops in the GCPD, found himself caught between professional skepticism and growing fascination with what appeared to be the most effective crime fighter Gotham had ever seen. Gordon had spent years watching the justice system fail victims while protecting criminals who could afford the right bribes. The idea that someone was succeeding where legitimate law enforcement had failed stirred something in Gordon's soul that he had thought corruption and cynicism had killed long ago. The first official acknowledgement of Batman's existence came after the Ace Chemical plant incident, though the public would not learn the full significance of that night for years to come. The Red Hood, a mysterious figure who had been robbing Gotham's most secure facilities while wearing a distinctive scarlet helmet, attempted to steal from Ace Chemical's payroll office. The robbery should have been routine, just another in a string of audacious heists that had made the Red Hood notorious throughout the city. Instead, it became the night that created Batman's greatest enemy. The man behind the Red Hood was a small-time comedian named Jack Napier, though that name would soon become irrelevant. Napier had been struggling to support his pregnant wife through a career that generated more rejections than paychecks. Desperation had driven him to accept an offer from Gotham's underworld to provide inside information about Ace Chemicals, where he had briefly worked as a tour guide. The plan was simple: wear the Red Hood disguise that the crime syndicate used to protect the identity of their operatives, lead them through the chemical plant's security systems, and collect enough money to leave Gotham forever. Batman had been tracking the Red Hood for weeks, analyzing his methods and predicting his next target through detective work that surpassed anything the GCPD had attempted. When the Red Hood and his associates entered Ace Chemicals that night, they found someone waiting for them who seemed to know their every move before they made it. Batman eliminated the Red Hood's backup with clinical efficiency, leaving Napier alone and terrified in a facility that had suddenly become his trap rather than his target. The chase that followed would become legend in Gotham's underworld. Batman pursued the Red Hood through Ace Chemicals' maze of catwalks and processing equipment, using psychological warfare as much as physical capability to drive his quarry toward increasingly desperate measures. Napier, already mentally fragile from months of financial pressure and the recent death of his wife in a household accident, found his sanity cracking under the relentless pursuit of something that seemed more demon than man. The confrontation ended when the Red Hood, cornered on a catwalk above one of Ace Chemicals' waste processing vats, chose to leap into the churning chemical soup rather than face capture. Batman watched the figure disappear beneath the surface of industrial acids that should have dissolved flesh from bone in seconds. Any reasonable person would have assumed that the Red Hood had chosen suicide over imprisonment. But the chemicals that should have killed Jack Napier instead transformed him into something far worse. The mixture of industrial bleaches and experimental compounds burned away his sanity along with his natural hair and skin pigmentation. When he emerged from that vat, Jack Napier had become the Joker, a creature driven by homicidal mania and an obsession with the Batman who had created him. The Joker's first killing spree announced his existence to Gotham with a signature that would become horrifically familiar over the decades to come. His victims died with rictus grins frozen on their faces, poisoned by a toxin that caused uncontrollable laughter during the final moments of life. The crime scenes were staged with theatrical flourishes that mocked traditional concepts of justice and order. Playing cards were left beside bodies as calling cards, each one bearing the Joker's grinning face instead of conventional imagery. Batman found himself facing an enemy unlike anything his training had prepared him for. The Joker operated without rational motivation, struck without predictable patterns, and seemed to view murder as performance art rather than criminal activity. Traditional detective work proved inadequate against someone whose actions were driven by insanity rather than logic. Batman began to understand that he had inadvertently created something that might be more dangerous than all of Gotham's conventional criminals combined. The dynamic between Batman and the Joker established a template that would define both characters for decades to come. Batman represented order imposed through methodical preparation and unwavering moral principles. The Joker embodied chaos that celebrated destruction for its own sake while mocking the very concept that life had meaning or purpose. Each victory by one side inspired greater efforts by the other, creating an escalating spiral of conflict that would eventually consume both their lives completely. Commissioner Gordon, watching this development with growing alarm, made a decision that would reshape Gotham's approach to law enforcement. Rather than opposing Batman's vigilante activities, Gordon began to see the masked figure as potentially the most effective ally honest cops could hope for in a city where corruption had rendered traditional policing almost meaningless. The bat signal, installed on the roof of GCPD headquarters, became the symbol of an unofficial partnership between law enforcement and vigilantism that would scandalize legal scholars while saving countless innocent lives. But Batman's success in combating street crime had unintended consequences that would haunt Gotham for decades. The Joker was only the first of what criminologists would later term the theatrical criminals, individuals whose psychopathic tendencies were channeled into elaborate personas that challenged Batman on psychological as much as physical levels. The Penguin transformed from a simple mob boss into a sophisticated criminal mastermind whose operations were characterized by avian-themed schemes and weapons. The Riddler evolved from a conventional burglar into someone whose crimes became intellectual puzzles designed specifically to challenge Batman's detective abilities. Each new costumed criminal represented an escalation in the war between Batman and Gotham's underworld. Traditional crime bosses like Carmine Falcone found themselves competing for influence with adversaries whose methods and motivations they could not understand or predict. The city's criminal ecosystem became increasingly complex as different factions adapted to the reality that Gotham now contained both a vigilante who could not be bought or intimidated, and criminals who operated according to rules that rational people could not comprehend. Into this volatile environment came Dick Grayson, a 12-year-old boy whose life was shattered by tragedy in ways that echoed Bruce Wayne's own childhood trauma. The Flying Graysons were Gotham's most celebrated circus family, acrobats whose death-defying performances drew audiences from across the country to Halley's Circus whenever it visited the city. Dick's parents, John and Mary Grayson, were artists who had devoted their lives to perfecting aerial routines that pushed human capability to its limits. Tony Zuko, a mid-level enforcer for the Falcone crime family, approached the circus management with the kind of protection racket that had become routine in Gotham's business community: pay monthly tribute to organized crime, or face consequences that would make continued operation impossible. When Halley's circus refused to submit to extortion, Zuko arranged for a demonstration that would ensure future compliance. The trapeze ropes that supported the flying Graysons during their signature triple somersault routine had been weakened with acid. As young Dick Grayson watched from the audience, his parents fell to their deaths in front of hundreds of horrified spectators. The boy who moments before had been part of Gotham's most celebrated circus family was now an orphan, traumatized by witnessing violence that had been orchestrated specifically to terrorize others into submission. Batman, present at the circus as Bruce Wayne on a rare evening of attempting normal social activity, recognized in Dick Grayson's eyes the same mixture of grief and rage that he had carried since his own parents' murder. The decision to take the boy under his protection was made in that moment of recognition, though its implications would not become clear for years to come. Bruce Wayne arranged for Dick's legal adoption, but Batman began training the boy for a mission that would define both their lives in ways neither could anticipate. The creation of Robin represented both Batman's greatest success and his most controversial decision. Dick Grayson possessed natural acrobatic abilities that complemented Batman's detective skills and combat training perfectly. The boy's courage and determination proved that trauma could be channeled into heroism rather than consuming those who experienced it. Robin became living proof that Batman's war on crime could inspire others to join the fight for justice rather than simply create more victims of violence. But involving a child in vigilante activities crossed moral lines that even Batman's supporters found difficult to defend. Critics argued that Bruce Wayne was perpetuating a cycle of violence by training Dick Grayson to fight criminals instead of helping the boy heal from his parents' murders through conventional therapy and education. The dynamic duo became a source of debate among those who supported Batman's mission while questioning his methods. For Dick Grayson himself, becoming Robin represented the difference between being consumed by grief and transforming that grief into something constructive. The boy who might have spent his life haunted by his parents' deaths instead found purpose in preventing other families from suffering similar losses. Training with Batman gave Dick skills and knowledge that most adults never acquired, but it also provided him with a sense of agency in a world where children were usually powerless to protect themselves or others. The partnership between Batman and Robin proved devastatingly effective against Gotham's criminals, who found themselves facing opponents whose combined abilities exceeded what either could accomplish alone. Batman's experience and resources merged with Robin's agility and fresh perspective to create a crime-fighting team that could adapt to any situation. The Batcave expanded to accommodate Robin's training needs and equipment, becoming a true headquarters for their shared mission. But success came with prices that both Batman and Robin were only beginning to understand. The boy who became Robin was following a path that would distance him from normal human relationships and experiences in ways that mirrored Bruce Wayne's own isolation. The mission that had saved Dick Grayson from despair was also consuming his childhood, replacing it with responsibilities and dangers that no 12-year-old should have to bear. The success of Batman and Robin created ripple effects throughout Gotham that neither Bruce Wayne nor Dick Grayson had anticipated when they first began their partnership. Their effectiveness against street crime and organized criminal operations inspired other individuals to take up masks and costumes in pursuit of their own versions of justice. Some of these new vigilantes proved valuable allies in the war against crime, while others became dangerous wildcards whose methods threatened to undermine everything Batman had worked to accomplish. Barbara Gordon, daughter of Commissioner Jim Gordon, represented the best example of how Batman's mission could inspire others to greatness. At 19, Barbara possessed a brilliant analytical mind that had earned her early admission to Gotham University's doctoral program in library science, along with advanced degrees in criminology and computer programming. She had grown up listening to her father discuss cases with the kind of passionate dedication to justice that had made him one of the few honest cops in Gotham's corrupt police department. Barbara's transformation into Batgirl began not with a dramatic origin story of personal tragedy, but with a calculated decision that fighting crime was simply the most effective way to serve her community. She had watched Batman and Robin operate from a distance, analyzing their methods and identifying areas where their partnership could benefit from additional support. Her academic training in information science made her uniquely qualified to handle the research and data analysis aspects of detective work that even Batman's formidable intellect could not manage single-handedly. The costume she designed for herself reflected both practical considerations and psychological warfare principles that Batman had pioneered. The bat symbol identified her as an ally to those who supported Batman's mission, while striking fear into criminals who had learned to associate that imagery with swift and certain justice. Her equipment emphasized mobility and stealth over the heavy armor that Batman favored, recognizing that her smaller frame and different fighting style required different tactical approaches. Barbara Gordon's debut as Batgirl came during the Joker's attempt to rob the Gotham Natural History Museum, an operation that should have been routine for someone of the Clown Prince of Crime's capabilities. The Joker had planned the heist as both a source of funding for larger schemes and a psychological message to Batman about the futility of protecting every potential target in a city as large as Gotham. His methods involved taking museum visitors hostage, while his accomplices loaded priceless artifacts into specially designed containers that could survive the chemical booby traps he had installed throughout the building. Batman and Robin arrived to find themselves facing not only the Joker's direct threat to innocent lives, but also a complex puzzle of death traps that required someone to remain with the hostages while others pursued the fleeing criminals. The tactical problem seemed insoluble until Batgirl appeared, demonstrating combat skills that complemented Batman's training while bringing fresh perspectives to the crisis that neither he nor Robin had considered. The successful resolution of the museum incident established Batgirl as a permanent member of what media outlets began calling the Bat family. Though Barbara Gordon's participation came with conditions that reflected both her independent nature and Commissioner Gordon's concerns about his daughter's safety. Unlike Robin, whose training had begun in childhood under Batman's direct supervision, Batgirl operated with considerable autonomy, contributing to joint missions while maintaining her own investigative priorities and methods. The expansion of Batman's war on crime to include multiple costumed allies created new possibilities for fighting criminal organizations that had previously been too large or too well connected for any individual vigilante to combat effectively. The Falcone crime family, which had dominated Gotham's underworld for decades through a combination of violence and corruption, suddenly found themselves facing opponents who could strike simultaneously at multiple locations while coordinating their efforts through advanced communication technology that civilian law enforcement lacked. Carmine Falcone, known throughout Gotham's criminal community as the Roman due to his preference for classical references and his imperious management style, had built his empire on the principle that traditional organized crime methods were superior to the theatrical approaches favored by costumed criminals like the Joker. Falcone's operations relied on discipline, hierarchy, and the systematic corruption of public officials rather than the unpredictable violence and elaborate schemes that characterized Gotham's newer breed of supervillains. The conflict between Batman's expanded team and the Falcone organization became a war of attrition that stretched over months, with each side adapting to the other's tactics while escalating their methods in response to temporary victories or defeats. Falcone's soldiers learned to coordinate their activities to avoid the kind of isolated operations that Batman, Robin, and Batgirl could easily disrupt. The Bat family developed increasingly sophisticated surveillance techniques that allowed them to map the crime family's entire organizational structure while gathering evidence that even corrupt prosecutors would find difficult to ignore. But the most significant development during this period was not the expansion of Batman's team or the escalation of his conflict with traditional organized crime. Instead, it was the emergence of a new category of criminal that would define Gotham's character for decades to come. The city began attracting individuals whose psychological profiles defied conventional understanding of criminal motivation, people who seemed drawn to Gotham specifically because it offered them the opportunity to test themselves against Batman and his allies. Dr. Jonathan Crane represented the intellectual extreme of this phenomenon. a former psychiatry professor at Gotham University, whose academic research had focused on the psychology of fear and its applications to behavior modification. Crane had been dismissed from his position after colleagues discovered that his experiments involved deliberately traumatizing human subjects in ways that violated every principle of medical ethics. His transformation into the Scarecrow began as an attempt to prove that his theories about fear-based conditioning were scientifically valid, but evolved into something far more dangerous when he discovered that terrorizing others provided him with psychological satisfaction that normal human relationships could never match. The Scarecrow's methods involved the use of specially designed chemical compounds that triggered specific phobias in his victims while leaving them conscious enough to experience maximum psychological trauma. His crimes were structured as experiments intended to demonstrate various hypotheses about human behavior under extreme stress, with innocent victims serving as unwilling test subjects whose suffering provided data for academic papers that Crane continued to write despite his expulsion from legitimate scientific communities. Batman's first encounter with the Scarecrow forced him to confront an enemy whose weapons attacked his mind rather than his body. Someone whose knowledge of psychology rivaled Batman's own understanding of criminal behavior. The fear toxins that Scarecrow employed were particularly effective against someone who had spent years transforming childhood trauma into a driving force for justice, creating hallucinations that forced Batman to relive his parents' murder while fighting for his life against an opponent who understood exactly how to exploit those psychological vulnerabilities. The defeat of the Scarecrow required Batman to develop new techniques for maintaining mental discipline under chemical influence, skills that would prove essential as Gotham attracted other criminals whose methods targeted the psychological weaknesses of their opponents. The experience also forced Batman to acknowledge that his mission was changing in ways he had not anticipated when he first donned the cape and cowl years earlier. Dr. Pamela Esley's transformation into Poison Ivy represented a different but equally dangerous evolution in Gotham's criminal ecosystem. A botanist whose legitimate research into plant-based pharmaceuticals had been corrupted by corporate pressure to produce profitable results regardless of environmental consequences, Isley had been exposed to experimental toxins during a laboratory accident that left her with altered body chemistry and an obsessive hatred of human civilization's impact on the natural world. Poison Ivy's crimes combined environmental terrorism with a seductive persona that allowed her to manipulate victims through pheromone-based mind control techniques that made traditional interrogation methods useless against her accomplices. Her schemes typically involved elaborate plans to eliminate human populations that she considered threats to plant life, using custom-designed toxins that could kill thousands of people while leaving vegetation completely unharmed. The challenge that Poison Ivy presented to Batman was not merely her chemical weapons or her ability to control plant life with supernatural effectiveness. Instead, it was her absolute conviction that her methods were morally justified by the magnitude of environmental destruction that human civilization had caused throughout history. Unlike criminals motivated by greed or power, Poison Ivy genuinely believed that mass murder was an ethical response to ecological damage, making her impossible to reason with through conventional means. Victor Freeze became Mr. Freeze through a tragedy that illustrated how easily legitimate scientific research could be corrupted into criminal activity when personal desperation overcame moral constraints. A cryogenics researcher whose wife Nora had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, Freeze had devoted his career to developing suspended animation techniques that could preserve terminal patients until medical science advanced enough to cure their conditions. When Gothcorp Industries attempted to shut down his research for financial reasons, Freeze had refused to abandon the work that represented his wife's only chance for survival. The confrontation with corporate security forces resulted in a laboratory accident that altered Fry's body chemistry so severely that he could only survive in sub-zero temperatures, transforming him into a being who required a specially designed cryogenic suit to prevent his death from exposure to normal environmental conditions. Mr. Freeze's crimes were motivated by the dual necessity of funding continued research into his wife's condition and obtaining revenge against those he held responsible for the accident that had transformed him into a living embodiment of cold and death. His freeze-ray technology made him capable of killing entire crowds of people instantly while preserving their bodies as ice sculptures that served as calling cards for future crimes. The emergence of these themed criminals forced Batman to acknowledge that his success in fighting conventional crime had inadvertently created a power vacuum that attracted individuals whose psychological profiles and criminal methods exceeded anything that traditional law enforcement agencies were equipped to handle. Arkham Asylum, originally designed as a treatment facility for conventional mental illness, was hastily converted into a specialized prison for criminals whose conditions defied normal psychiatric understanding. Dr. Amadeus Arkham, the institution's founder and chief psychiatrist, had designed the facility based on early 20th century theories about mental illness that emphasized rehabilitation through therapeutic treatment rather than simple incarceration. But the criminals that Batman began delivering to Arkham required security measures and treatment approaches that Dr. Arkham's humanitarian philosophy had never anticipated. The Joker's presence at Arkham transformed the institution from a hospital into something more resembling a maximum security prison, designed to contain individuals whose psychological conditions made them fundamentally incompatible with normal human society. His ability to manipulate both staff members and fellow patients created an atmosphere of constant tension that made therapeutic treatment impossible, while turning the facility into a breeding ground for criminal conspiracies that could threaten the entire city. Batman found himself caught in an ethical dilemma that would define his mission for decades to come. The criminals he fought were clearly mentally ill individuals who needed treatment rather than punishment, but their conditions made them too dangerous to be housed in conventional psychiatric facilities. The question of whether figures like the Joker, Scarecrow, and Poison Ivy could ever be rehabilitated through therapy became a source of ongoing debate among mental health professionals who studied the unique challenges that Gotham's costumed criminals presented to established psychiatric theories. The partnership between Batman and Robin began to show strain as Dick Grayson approached his 16th birthday and started questioning the life that Bruce Wayne had chosen for him. What had begun as a shared mission of justice was evolving into something more complex as the boy who had found purpose in fighting crime began to desire experiences that extended beyond the confines of Gotham's never-ending war against its criminal element. Dick's concerns were not rooted in cowardice or a loss of commitment to their shared mission. Instead, they reflected his growing understanding that the path he was following would ultimately consume his entire life in ways that might prevent him from forming the kind of normal relationships and pursuing the kinds of personal goals that most young people took for granted. The realization that he was becoming increasingly isolated from his peers at school troubled Dick in ways that he struggled to articulate to Bruce, whose own childhood trauma had made normal social development impossible long before he had become Batman. The emergence of the Teen Titans provided Dick Grayson with his first taste of what it might be like to work with other young heroes who understood the unique challenges of balancing superhuman responsibilities with adolescent development. When Starfire, Beast Boy, Raven, and Cyborg began operating as a team based in Jump City, they offered Robin the opportunity to take on leadership responsibilities that would have been impossible while working as Batman's junior partner in Gotham. Bruce Wayne's reaction to Dick's interest in the Teen Titans revealed aspects of his personality that both Alfred and Dick had suspected, but never directly confronted. Batman had become so accustomed to operating with complete control over every aspect of his mission, that the idea of his partner developing independent relationships and responsibilities triggered deep-seated anxieties about abandonment that Bruce had never fully processed from his own childhood trauma. The arguments between Bruce and Dick during this period were characterized by emotional intensity that neither had experienced since the early days of their partnership. Dick accused Bruce of trying to control his life in ways that went far beyond their shared commitment to fighting crime, while Bruce struggled to articulate fears that losing his partner would mean facing Gotham's darkness alone in ways that might ultimately prove psychologically unsustainable. Alfred watched these conflicts with growing concern, recognizing that both Bruce and Dick were approaching emotional breaking points that could permanently damage their relationship if not handled with extraordinary care and wisdom. The butler, who had raised Bruce from childhood and watched Dick grow from a traumatized 12-year-old into a capable young hero, understood better than either of them how much they needed each other, not just as crime-fighting partners, but as the closest thing to family that either had ever known. The resolution of this crisis came through a compromise that satisfied neither Bruce nor Dick completely, but allowed their partnership to continue evolving in ways that acknowledged Dick's need for independence while preserving the emotional bonds that had sustained them both through years of facing dangers that would have destroyed normal relationships. Dick would continue operating as Robin when Gotham needed him, but he would also be free to work with the Teen Titans and pursue personal relationships that extended beyond the world of costumed vigilantes. This arrangement worked reasonably well for several months, until Jason Todd entered their lives under circumstances that reminded both Bruce and Dick of how fragile their hard-won stability really was. Jason was a 14-year-old street kid who had been surviving in Crime Alley through a combination of petty theft and an intimate knowledge of Gotham's criminal underworld that most adults never acquired. His parents had died when he was 12, leaving him to navigate a hostile environment with nothing but his wits and a fierce determination to avoid the fate that claimed most homeless children in Gotham's poorest neighborhoods. Batman first encountered Jason when the boy attempted to steal the Batmobile's tires while the vehicle was parked outside a warehouse where Batman was investigating a drug smuggling operation. The audacity of trying to rob Batman himself impressed Bruce Wayne almost as much as the technical skill that Jason displayed in nearly succeeding despite the Batmobile's advanced security systems. More importantly, Batman recognized in Jason's eyes the same mixture of anger and determination that he had seen in Dick Grayson years earlier. Jason Todd's background was significantly different from Dick Grayson's in ways that would profoundly influence his development as Robin. Where Dick had grown up in the loving environment of a circus family before tragedy struck, Jason had experienced poverty, neglect, and violence as routine aspects of daily life long before his parents' deaths. His worldview had been shaped by the harsh realities of street survival rather than the disciplined artistry of professional acrobatics, making him both more aggressive and more cynical than Dick had ever been. The decision to train Jason as the second Robin was controversial even within the Bat family itself. Dick Grayson expressed concerns that Bruce was moving too quickly to replace him, rather than allowing Jason the time and individual attention necessary to develop the emotional stability that effective crime fighting required. Alfred worried that Jason's anger toward the world might make him unsuitable for a mission that demanded careful moral judgment, even in life-or-death situations. Bruce Wayne's motivations for taking Jason under his protection were complex and not entirely rational. Part of his decision reflected genuine compassion for a boy whose circumstances paralleled his own childhood trauma in important ways. But another part was driven by Bruce's subconscious need to prove that his methods of channeling grief into heroism could work for other traumatized children, validating choices he had made about his own life that he sometimes questioned during moments of honest self-reflection. Jason's training as Robin proceeded at an accelerated pace that concerned everyone who observed it. Where Dick Grayson had spent years gradually building his skills under careful supervision, Jason was pushed to achieve combat proficiency and detective capabilities within months of joining the Bat family. The urgency driving this compressed training schedule reflected Bruce's growing awareness that Gotham's criminal threats were escalating in ways that might soon overwhelm even Batman's formidable capabilities. The Joker had been developing increasingly elaborate schemes that targeted not just individual victims, but entire neighborhoods through citywide terror campaigns designed to prove that chaos was the natural state of human civilization. His partnership with other Arkham inmates like the Scarecrow and Poison Ivy created combinations of psychological warfare and mass destruction that stretched Batman's resources to their limits while generating public pressure for more aggressive law enforcement responses that could have undermined the delicate cooperation between the GCPD and Gotham's vigilante protectors. Harvey Dent's transformation into Two-Face represented a particularly devastating blow to Batman's faith in Gotham's potential for positive change. As Gotham's district attorney, Dent had been one of the few public officials whose commitment to justice was beyond question, someone whose prosecutorial success had provided legal support for many of Batman's victories against organized crime. His partnership with Commissioner Gordon and Batman had created what media outlets called the Triumvirate, three men whose cooperation seemed to offer genuine hope for Gotham's future. The attack that created Two-Face occurred during a court proceeding where Dent was prosecuting Sal Maroni, one of Carmine Falcone's most dangerous lieutenants, on charges that could have resulted in a life sentence. Maroni had smuggled a flask of acid into the courtroom, ostensibly containing antacid medication for a stomach condition, but actually filled with industrial-strength corrosive that he threw directly into Dent's face when the prosecutor approached the witness stand during cross-examination. The physical damage to Harvey Dent's face was horrific, destroying nerve tissue and muscle in ways that left him permanently disfigured despite the best efforts of Gotham's plastic surgeons. But the psychological trauma proved even more devastating, triggering a dissociative identity disorder that transformed Gotham's most effective prosecutor into one of its most dangerous criminals. The Harvey Dent personality retained its commitment to justice and legal procedure, while the Two-Face personality embraced violence and chaos as appropriate responses to a world where random acts of brutality could destroy even the most carefully constructed life. Two-Face's crimes were characterized by an obsession with duality and chance that reflected Harvey Dent's shattered psyche in ways that made rehabilitation seem almost impossible. Every decision was determined by the flip of a two-headed coin that had been damaged in the same acid attack that had created Two-Face's condition. The scarred side of the coin represented violence and destruction, while the clean side represented mercy and restraint, creating a pattern of criminal behavior that was simultaneously predictable and completely random. Batman's attempts to save Harvey Dent from his Two-Face persona became one of his most persistent failures, a reminder that even his most sophisticated understanding of criminal psychology had limitations when confronted with mental illness that had been caused by traumatic brain injury rather than purely psychological factors. The friendship between Bruce Wayne and Harvey Dent, which had been one of the few normal relationships that Bruce had managed to maintain despite his double life as Batman, became another casualty of Gotham's endless cycle of violence and corruption. The loss of Harvey Dent as an ally coincided with Jason Todd's first major failure as Robin, an incident that revealed how much the second Robin's aggressive tendencies differed from Dick Grayson's more measured approach to crime fighting. During a confrontation with a child prostitution ring operating out of several Gotham hotels, Jason's anger at the criminals' treatment of victims his own age led him to use excessive force against suspects who were already subdued and ready for arrest. The controversy that followed this incident forced Batman to acknowledge that Jason Todd might never develop the emotional control necessary for effective vigilante work. Unlike Dick Grayson, whose circus background had taught him discipline and precision, Jason approached crime fighting as an outlet for rage that had been building throughout his childhood on Gotham's streets. His methods were undeniably effective against criminals who deserved whatever punishment they received, but they crossed lines that Batman had established as essential boundaries for anyone operating under the Bat symbol. The internal conflicts within the Bat family were complicated by external pressures from both law enforcement and criminal organizations that had learned to exploit divisions between Batman and his allies. Commissioner Loeb, still thoroughly corrupt despite the periodic investigations that honest cops like Jim Gordon attempted to launch against him, began coordinating with organized crime figures to create situations where Batman and Robin would be forced to operate separately, making them more vulnerable to coordinated attacks. The Falcone crime family had spent months analyzing Batman's methods and identifying patterns that could be used to predict his responses to various criminal activities. Their conclusion was that Batman's effectiveness depended heavily on his ability to coordinate multiple approaches to complex problems a capability that was significantly reduced when conflicts within his own organization forced him to divide his attention between crime fighting and managing interpersonal relationships. The scheme that Carmine Falcone developed to exploit these weaknesses involved simultaneous attacks on multiple targets that would force Batman to choose which innocent lives to save, while leaving others at the mercy of criminals who had planned their operations specifically to take advantage of his psychological need to protect everyone. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its recognition that Batman's greatest strength, his unwillingness to abandon anyone who needed protection, could also be his greatest vulnerability. On a cold February night, the Falcone family launched coordinated attacks on a children's hospital in the Diamond District, a homeless shelter in the Narrows, and an elementary school in Robinson Park. Each location contained dozens of innocent victims and was defended by armed criminals prepared to kill hostages if Batman attempted to interfere with their operations. The message was clear: Batman could not save everyone, and his attempt to do so would result in more deaths than if he had simply allowed the criminals to complete their objectives without interference. The crisis that followed would test every relationship within the Bat family, while forcing Batman to confront limitations in his mission that he had never been willing to acknowledge. The decisions made during those few hours would have consequences that stretched across decades, reshaping not only Batman's approach to crime fighting, but his understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where heroes were expected to accomplish the impossible while bearing responsibility for every life they failed to save. The coordinated attack on Gotham's most vulnerable populations represented a turning point in the war between Batman and organized crime, but not in ways that Carmine Falcone had anticipated when he developed his strategy to exploit Batman's psychological need to protect innocent life. Rather than breaking Batman's spirit or forcing him to abandon his mission, the crisis revealed reserves of determination and capability that even Bruce Wayne had not known he possessed. The solution to the impossible choice between three groups of hostages required Batman to do something he had never attempted before. Instead of trying to handle the crisis alone, or with Robin's assistance, he activated every resource at his disposal simultaneously, creating a coordinated response that involved not just the Bat family, but also allies throughout Gotham's legitimate institutions, who had been waiting for an opportunity to strike back against the criminal organizations that had terrorized their city for decades. Commissioner Gordon received detailed intelligence about all three hostage situations along with tactical recommendations for GCPD responses that would complement rather than interfere with Batman's operations. Judge Maria Vargas, one of the few members of Gotham's judiciary who had refused Falcone family bribes, signed emergency warrants that gave law enforcement unprecedented authority to use whatever force was necessary to resolve the crisis. District Attorney Rachel Dawes, Harvey Dent's temporary replacement, coordinated with federal authorities to ensure that any criminals captured during the operation would face charges in courts beyond the reach of local corruption. The assault on the three locations began simultaneously at precisely 11:37 p.m., timed to take advantage of shift changes in both legitimate and criminal organizations that would minimize the number of innocent bystanders while maximizing the element of surprise. Batman and Robin took point on the children's hospital operation, which involved the largest number of potential victims and the most complex security challenges. Batgirl coordinated with GCPD SWAT teams at the homeless shelter, where her knowledge of the building's layout from previous volunteer work gave her tactical advantages that purely law enforcement approaches would have lacked. The elementary school presented the most dangerous situation because the criminals holding it had been specifically instructed to kill hostages at the first sign of police activity. This location required a response that was both completely covert and absolutely decisive, eliminating the threat before the hostage takers could react to the presence of rescuers. The solution came from an unexpected source when Alfred Pennyworth volunteered to infiltrate the school using his background in British intelligence operations, skills that he had never revealed to Bruce Wayne despite their years of partnership. Alfred's approach to the elementary school crisis demonstrated capabilities that transformed Bruce's understanding of the man who had raised him from childhood. Moving with the silent efficiency of someone who had conducted similar operations during wartime, Alfred neutralized 3 armed criminals and secured the release of 47 children and 6 teachers without firing a single shot or causing any civilian casualties. The techniques he employed were so precisely executed that the hostage-takers never realized they were under attack until they found themselves unconscious and zip-tied in the school's gymnasium. The success of all 3 rescue operations within a 20-minute window sent shockwaves through Gotham's criminal community that extended far beyond the immediate failure of Carmine Falcone's strategy. For the first time since Batman had begun operating in Gotham, organized crime faced the reality that their opponents possessed resources and coordination capabilities that exceeded what any individual vigilante should have been able to command. The implications were terrifying for criminal organizations that had built their power on the assumption that corruption and intimidation could neutralize any threat to their operations. But the most significant consequence of the coordinated rescue operation was its effect on Jason Todd, whose role in the children's hospital assault had required him to witness violence against innocent children that even his harsh upbringing in Crime Alley had not prepared him for. The criminals holding the hospital had been selected specifically for their willingness to torture victims as a means of psychological warfare against Batman, and their treatment of pediatric patients exceeded even Jason's cynical expectations about human cruelty. The rage that Jason Todd felt during and after the hospital rescue operation represented a fundamental shift in his psychological development that would influence every aspect of his future as Robin. Where Dick Grayson had learned to channel anger into focused determination, Jason began to view violence as an appropriate response to suffering that could not be prevented through conventional heroic methods. His questions about Batman's no-kill rule became more frequent and more challenging, reflecting a growing belief that some criminals deserved death rather than incarceration. Bruce Wayne recognized the dangerous direction of Jason's thinking, but struggled to address it effectively because the boy's arguments contained logical elements that Bruce himself had wrestled with throughout his career as Batman. The Joker alone had killed hundreds of innocent people during his various escape attempts from Arkham Asylum, deaths that could have been prevented permanently if Batman had been willing to cross the line that separated justice from vengeance. Jason's willingness to articulate these uncomfortable truths forced Bruce to confront moral compromises that he had been avoiding through years of careful rationalization. The emergence of other vigilantes throughout Gotham during this period reflected the broader impact that Batman's mission was having on individuals who had concluded that traditional approaches to fighting crime were inadequate for the threats their city faced. Some of these new heroes, like the Huntress, brought valuable skills and perspectives to the war against organized crime while operating according to moral codes that generally aligned with Batman's principles. Helena Bertinelli had become the Huntress after witnessing the massacre of her family by rival crime organizations when she was 8 years old, an origin story that paralleled Bruce Wayne's childhood trauma in significant ways. But where Bruce had channeled his pain into a mission dedicated to protecting innocent life, Helena's approach to vigilante justice included a willingness to kill criminals who posed ongoing threats to community safety. Her methods were undeniably effective against enemies who had proven immune to conventional law enforcement, but they represented a philosophical challenge to everything Batman had built his mission around. The partnership between Batman and the Huntress was characterized by constant tension between Bruce's insistence that heroes must never become killers and Helena's argument that some criminals forfeited their right to life through their actions against innocent victims. Their joint operations against the Bertinelli family's murderers proved devastatingly effective, but they also forced Bruce to confront the possibility that his moral absolutes might be luxuries that other heroes could not afford given their different backgrounds and circumstances. Other new vigilantes proved more problematic than helpful, including individuals whose psychological profiles suggested that they were attracted to costume heroics for reasons that had little to do with genuine commitment to justice. The rise of what media outlets termed copycat vigilantes created public relations challenges for Batman's mission, while providing criminal organizations with opportunities to discredit legitimate heroes by associating them with unstable individuals whose methods undermined public support for vigilante activities. The most dangerous of these problematic heroes was Azrael, who operated according to religious beliefs that classified certain categories of criminals as irredeemably evil, and therefore appropriate targets for execution. Jean-Paul Valley had been trained from childhood by the Order of St. Dumas, a secretive religious organization that viewed crime fighting as a form of holy war against spiritual corruption that threatened human civilization. His costume and weapons were designed to evoke medieval imagery of divine judgment, and his methods included torture techniques that he believed were necessary to extract information from criminals who served supernatural forces of evil. Batman's first encounter with Azrael revealed the extent to which Gotham's growing reputation as a haven for costumed heroes was attracting individuals whose understanding of justice differed fundamentally from Bruce Wayne's carefully developed moral philosophy. Azrael's effectiveness against organized crime was undeniable, but his willingness to kill suspects and torture prisoners threatened to undermine years of careful relationship building between Batman and Gotham's law enforcement community. The theological discussions between Batman and Azrael became some of the most complex conversations Bruce Wayne had ever engaged in regarding the moral foundations of heroic action. Jean-Paul Valley possessed extensive knowledge of philosophy, history, and religious doctrine that allowed him to defend his methods through sophisticated arguments about the nature of evil and the obligations of those called to fight against it. His contention that some criminals represented manifestations of spiritual corruption that could not be reformed through conventional rehabilitation challenged Bruce's secular humanist assumptions about criminal behavior and appropriate responses to it. The influence that these various vigilantes had on Jason Todd's development became increasingly apparent as the second Robin began to adopt tactics and attitudes that reflected their approaches to crime fighting rather than the more restrained methods that Batman had tried to teach him. Jason's admiration for the Huntress's directness and Azrael's uncompromising commitment to eliminating threats created friction within the Bat family that Alfred worried might eventually tear apart the relationships that had sustained them all through years of facing dangers that would have destroyed normal families. The breaking point came during a joint operation against a human trafficking ring that had been operating out of Gotham's Port District with the protection of corrupt customs officials and complicit shipping companies. The scale of suffering that the investigation revealed exceeded even Jason Todd's cynical expectations about human cruelty, involving hundreds of victims who had been transported across international borders under conditions that frequently resulted in death from disease, malnutrition, or violence. When Batman, Robin, and their allies finally cornered the trafficking operations leadership in a warehouse filled with evidence of their crimes, Jason Todd was faced with a choice that would define his understanding of justice for the rest of his life. The criminals they had captured were directly responsible for the deaths of dozens of innocent victims, and their connections to corrupt officials made it likely that they would escape meaningful punishment through the conventional legal system. The decision that Jason made in that warehouse represented a fundamental rejection of everything that Batman had tried to teach him about the difference between justice and vengeance. Rather than allowing the traffickers to be turned over to law enforcement for prosecution through legitimate channels, Jason chose to execute the operation's leader with a deliberateness that demonstrated how completely his moral development had diverged from Bruce Wayne's carefully constructed ethical framework. The aftermath of Jason's choice forced Batman to confront the possibility that his mission was creating heroes whose methods might ultimately prove more dangerous than the criminals they fought against. The realization that his influence on traumatized young people was not automatically positive represented a crisis of faith that would influence every decision Bruce Wayne made about involving others in his war against crime. But the most devastating consequence of Jason Todd's evolution toward lethal methods was still to come, in the form of a confrontation with the Joker that would test every principle Batman had developed about the value of human life, and the meaning of heroism in a world where good intentions were no guarantee of positive outcomes. The conflict between Batman's moral code and Jason Todd's increasingly violent methods reached a crisis point when the Joker orchestrated his most ambitious scheme to date, one designed specifically to prove that even the most principled heroes would eventually abandon their ethics when faced with sufficient psychological pressure. The Clown Prince of Crime had spent months studying Batman's relationship with the second Robin, analyzing their joint operations and identifying the emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited to drive a permanent wedge between them. The scheme began with a series of seemingly random attacks on Gotham's social service agencies, targeting organizations that provided support to homeless children and other vulnerable populations. Each attack was designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on Jason Todd, whose own childhood experiences in Crime Alley had given him deep empathy for young victims of urban violence. The Joker understood that Jason's protective instincts regarding children represented both his greatest strength as a hero and his most exploitable weakness as a human being. The pattern of attacks escalated over several weeks, with each incident more brutal than the previous one, building toward a confrontation that would force Jason to choose between following Batman's rules and protecting innocent lives through whatever means necessary. The Joker's psychological manipulation was sophisticated enough to make Jason believe that he was making independent decisions about criminal justice, when in reality every choice was being guided toward a predetermined outcome that would serve the Joker's larger purpose of corrupting Batman's mission from within. The final phase of the Joker's plan involved the kidnapping of several teenage runaways who had been living in an abandoned warehouse in Crime Alley, the same neighborhood where both Bruce Wayne and Jason Todd had experienced the childhood traumas that had shaped their adult lives. The symbolism was deliberate and personal, designed to trigger emotional responses that would override rational decision-making processes in both Batman and Robin. When Batman and Robin arrived at the warehouse where the hostages were being held, they found themselves facing a situation that had been specifically engineered to create an impossible moral dilemma. The Joker had rigged explosive devices throughout the building that would detonate if tampered with, but the timers were set to allow just enough time for either rescuing the hostages or apprehending the Joker, but not both. The choice between saving innocent lives and stopping a mass murderer represented exactly the kind of utilitarian calculation that Batman's absolute moral principles were designed to avoid. Jason Todd's response to this dilemma revealed how completely his understanding of heroism had diverged from Bruce Wayne's original vision. Rather than accepting the Joker's false choice between two inadequate options, Jason proposed a third alternative that would involve killing the Joker immediately, thereby eliminating the threat to the hostages while ensuring that the Clown Prince of Crime could never orchestrate similar schemes in the future. The logic of Jason's proposal was undeniable from a purely practical perspective, but it represented a fundamental violation of everything that Batman's mission was supposed to represent. The argument between Batman and Robin in that warehouse became one of the most heated exchanges they had ever had. With Jason articulating positions about justice and moral responsibility that challenged Bruce Wayne's most basic assumptions about heroism, Jason contended that Batman's refusal to kill the Joker was itself a form of moral cowardice that prioritized abstract ethical principles over concrete protection of innocent life. Every person that the Joker had killed since his first capture could have been saved if Batman had been willing to make the difficult but necessary choice to end a threat permanently, rather than repeatedly delivering him to a criminal justice system that had proven incapable of containing him. Bruce Wayne's response to Jason's challenge revealed the extent to which his own moral certainties had been eroded by years of witnessing the failures of his principled approach to crime fighting. The Joker had indeed killed hundreds of innocent people during his various escapes from Arkham Asylum, deaths that could theoretically have been prevented if Batman had been willing to cross the line that separated justice from vengeance. But Bruce's counterargument focused on the long-term consequences of heroes deciding which criminals deserved death, a precedent that could eventually lead to vigilante executions of suspects whose guilt was less certain or whose crimes were less severe. The philosophical deadlock between Batman and Robin was broken not by rational argument, but by the Joker's manipulation of the situation to force an immediate decision. The timer on the explosive devices began counting down faster than expected, creating time pressure that made extended moral debate impossible while the lives of innocent hostages hung in the balance. The choice had to be made immediately, and it had to be made by someone willing to take responsibility for its consequence, regardless of the ethical framework used to justify it. What happened next would haunt Batman for decades, and fundamentally alter his relationship with every subsequent partner who joined his mission. Jason Todd made the choice that Bruce Wayne could not make, killing the Joker with a precision that demonstrated both his combat training and his absolute commitment to protecting the innocent victims whose lives hung in the balance. The explosion that followed was contained by Jason's quick thinking and technical knowledge, saving the hostages but creating a crime scene that would be impossible to explain to law enforcement officials who arrived expecting to find the Joker alive and ready for another stay in Arkham Asylum. The aftermath of the Joker's death created complications that extended far beyond the immediate moral and legal questions surrounding Jason's actions. Gotham's criminal community reacted to news of the Clown Prince of Crime's demise with a mixture of relief and terror, understanding that the precedent of vigilante executions could easily be extended to other criminals who had previously assumed that capture by Batman meant imprisonment rather than death. Some criminal organizations began developing more aggressive tactics for dealing with Batman and his allies, reasoning that if heroes were willing to kill their enemies, then criminals had no choice but to respond with equivalent lethality. More significantly, the Joker's death triggered a power vacuum in Gotham's theatrical criminal community that was quickly filled by individuals whose methods made even the Clown Prince of Crime's schemes seem relatively restrained. The absence of the Joker's charismatic leadership allowed more extreme elements within Arkham Asylum to organize themselves around even more destructive philosophies of chaos and violence. The result was an escalation of criminal activity that made Gotham less safe rather than more secure, despite the elimination of its most notorious villain. Batman's response to Jason's execution of the Joker revealed psychological conflicts that Bruce Wayne had been suppressing throughout his career as a vigilante. Part of him felt enormous relief that the Joker could never again threaten innocent lives or manipulate other criminals into increasingly destructive schemes. But another part recognized that Jason's willingness to kill represented a fundamental failure of Batman's mission to inspire others toward heroism rather than vengeance. The realization that his influence on traumatized young people was not automatically positive forced Bruce to question every aspect of how he had approached training partners and allies over the years. The relationship between Batman and Robin became increasingly strained as Jason began to apply lethal methods to other criminals whose cases seemed to warrant permanent solutions rather than temporary imprisonment. Jason's targets were carefully chosen individuals whose guilt was undeniable and whose continuing existence posed clear threats to community safety, but the pattern of vigilante executions created a climate of fear among Gotham's criminal population that began affecting the behavior of honest citizens as well. The line between heroic protection and authoritarian control became increasingly difficult to maintain as Jason's methods proved devastatingly effective against criminal organizations that had previously operated with relative impunity. Alfred Pennyworth watched these developments with growing alarm, recognizing that the Bat family was evolving in directions that threatened to undermine everything that Thomas and Martha Wayne had valued about justice and compassion. The butler who had raised Bruce Wayne from childhood understood better than anyone how easily the mission to protect innocent life could become corrupted into something that served the psychological needs of vigilantes rather than the genuine welfare of the community they claimed to protect. The crisis deepened when other heroes throughout Gotham began to question whether Batman's traditional no-kill rule was actually serving the cause of justice or simply enabling criminal activity by ensuring that dangerous individuals would always have opportunities to escape and resume their attacks on innocent victims. The Huntress openly praised Jason Todd's execution of the Joker, arguing that it demonstrated the kind of moral courage that effective crime fighting required in a city where conventional law enforcement had proven inadequate. Even Batgirl expressed private doubts about whether Batman's principles were compatible with the realities of protecting a population that faced threats from criminals whose psychological profiles suggested they could never be rehabilitated through conventional treatment. The external validation that Jason received from other heroes reinforced his belief that his methods represented an evolution of Batman's mission rather than a betrayal of its fundamental principles. Jason began to see himself as the logical successor to Batman's legacy, someone who possessed the courage to make difficult decisions that Bruce Wayne's psychological limitations prevented him from considering. The second Robin's growing confidence in his own judgment created friction within the Bat family that threatened to destroy relationships that had sustained them all through years of facing dangers that would have overwhelmed any individual hero. The breaking point came when Jason Todd announced his intention to execute Harvey Dent during Two-Face's next criminal operation, arguing that the former district attorney's continuing crimes demonstrated the futility of attempting rehabilitation for individuals whose mental conditions made them permanent threats to public safety. Jason's proposal was supported by detailed psychological analysis and criminal history documentation that made a compelling case for permanent elimination of the Two-Face threat, but it represented a line that Batman absolutely could not allow any of his allies to cross. The confrontation between Batman and Robin over Harvey Dent's fate became a defining moment that would influence every subsequent decision Bruce Wayne made about involving other people in his mission. The argument revealed irreconcilable differences in their understanding of justice, heroism, and the obligations that came with the power to take human life. Jason's position was logically consistent and practically effective, but it demanded moral compromises that would ultimately transform Batman's mission from protection of innocent life into systematic elimination of threats deemed unacceptable by vigilante judgment. The resolution of this crisis required Batman to make choices about the future of his mission that he had been avoiding throughout his career as Gotham's protector. The realization that his methods of training partners had created someone whose approach to crime fighting might ultimately prove more dangerous than beneficial forced Bruce Wayne to confront fundamental questions about whether his mission was truly serving the cause of justice or simply perpetuating a cycle of violence that would eventually consume everyone who participated in it. The revelation that Jason Todd had not actually killed the Joker came in the form of a videotaped message that arrived at Wayne Manor exactly 6 months after the warehouse incident. The tape showed the Clown Prince of Crime very much alive, his distinctive laugh echoing through what appeared to be a makeshift broadcast studio, as he explained how he had orchestrated the entire scenario to drive a wedge between Batman and Robin. The body that Jason had believed he was destroying had been a carefully constructed duplicate, while the real Joker had watched the entire confrontation from a hidden location within the warehouse. The psychological manipulation was even more sophisticated than Bruce Wayne had initially realized. The Joker had not simply wanted to corrupt Jason Todd by tricking him into killing. Instead, he had wanted to create a situation where Batman would lose faith in his ability to train partners, where Jason would lose confidence in his own moral judgment, and where the entire Bat family would begin to question the philosophical foundations of their mission. The false death had been designed to achieve maximum psychological damage to everyone involved while positioning the Joker as puppet master pulling strings that his enemies could not even see. Bruce Wayne's reaction to learning that the Joker remained alive was complicated by emotions he struggled to acknowledge even to himself. Relief that Jason had not actually crossed the line into killing was mixed with anger at having been manipulated so thoroughly, and both feelings were overshadowed by a growing recognition that the Joker's understanding of human psychology might be superior to his own. The villain's ability to predict and control the responses of supposedly rational people suggested that Batman's entire approach to crime fighting was based on assumptions about human nature that were fundamentally flawed. Jason Todd's response to the revelation was even more disturbing. Rather than feeling relieved that he had not actually killed the Joker, Jason expressed regret that his execution had not been successful. The months following what he had believed was the Joker's death had convinced Jason that Gotham was genuinely safer when dangerous criminals were permanently eliminated rather than repeatedly captured and imprisoned. The discovery that the Joker remained alive only reinforced Jason's belief that Batman's no-kill rule was ultimately counterproductive to their mission of protecting innocent life. The philosophical divide between Batman and Robin became unbridgeable when Jason announced his intention to track down and actually kill the Joker, arguing that the Clown Prince of Crime's latest manipulation proved beyond doubt that he could never be contained through conventional methods. Jason's position was supported by detailed analysis of every known Joker escape from Arkham Asylum, demonstrating patterns of escalating violence that suggested the villain's psychological condition was deteriorating rather than improving over time. Batman's refusal to allow Jason to pursue the Joker with lethal intent created a crisis within the Bat family that threatened to destroy relationships that had sustained them through years of facing impossible dangers together. Alfred found himself caught between loyalty to Bruce Wayne and genuine concern that Jason Todd might be correct about the necessity of permanent solutions to threats that the conventional justice system could not handle effectively. Even Barbara Gordon expressed private doubts about whether Batman's moral absolutes were serving the cause of justice or simply enabling criminal activity. The confrontation that followed became one of the most intense arguments in the history of the Bat family, with Jason challenging not just Batman's tactics, but the entire philosophical framework that Bruce Wayne had constructed to justify his mission. Jason argued that Batman's refusal to kill dangerous criminals was itself a form of moral cowardice that prioritized abstract ethical principles over concrete protection of innocent victims. Every person that the Joker killed in future schemes would be dying because Batman lacked the courage to make necessary but difficult decisions about eliminating permanent threats. Bruce Wayne's counterargument focused on the long-term consequences of vigilantes deciding which criminals deserved death, but his position was weakened by the obvious failures of his principled approach to containing repeat offenders. The Joker alone had killed hundreds of people during his various escapes from Arkham, deaths that could theoretically have been prevented if Batman had been willing to cross lines that separated justice from vengeance. Jason's willingness to articulate these uncomfortable truths forced Bruce to confront moral compromises that he had been avoiding through years of careful rationalization. The breaking point came when Jason Todd left Wayne Manor in the middle of the night, taking specialized equipment and weapons that would allow him to operate independently of Batman's oversight and moral constraints. The note he left behind explained that he could no longer participate in a mission that seemed designed to perpetuate rather than solve Gotham's crime problems. Jason's departure represented not just the loss of a partner, but the failure of everything Bruce Wayne had hoped to accomplish by training young heroes to carry forward his mission. Alfred's attempts to mediate between Bruce and Jason revealed the depth of the butler's own doubts about the direction that Batman's mission had taken over the years. The man who had raised Bruce Wayne from childhood understood better than anyone how easily the desire to protect innocent life could become corrupted into something that served the psychological needs of vigilantes rather than the genuine welfare of the community. Alfred's suggestion that both Bruce and Jason needed professional counseling to address the trauma that was driving their increasingly extreme responses to criminal activity was met with resistance from both sides of the conflict. The search for Jason Todd became Batman's primary obsession during the months that followed, as Bruce Wayne struggled to locate his former partner before the young man could carry out his threatened execution of the Joker. The investigation revealed that Jason had been secretly building a network of contacts and resources that would support independent vigilante operations, suggesting that his departure from the Bat family had been planned for much longer than his final argument with Bruce had suggested. The trail led Batman through Gotham's underworld and beyond, as Jason's investigation of the Joker's activities took him to international locations where the Clown Prince of Crime had established connections with terrorist organizations and criminal syndicates. Jason's detective work proved to be surprisingly sophisticated, demonstrating that his training under Batman had given him capabilities that extended far beyond simple combat skills. The realization that Jason was more competent as an independent operator than Bruce had anticipated added urgency to the search, while raising uncomfortable questions about whether Batman's controlling approach to partnerships had actually hindered rather than helped his allies' development. The discovery that Jason had allied himself with international mercenaries and assassins in his hunt for the Joker forced Batman to confront the possibility that his former partner was evolving into something more dangerous than the criminals they had once fought together. Jason's willingness to work with individuals whose moral codes were even more flexible than his own suggested that the line between hero and villain was becoming increasingly blurred in his mind. The psychological pressure of hunting his former partner, while simultaneously trying to protect him from the consequences of his choices, began to take a visible toll on Batman's effectiveness as Gotham's protector. Commissioner Gordon noticed that Batman's responses to routine criminal activity had become more aggressive and less measured, suggesting that the stress of the situation with Jason was affecting his judgment in ways that could endanger innocent civilians. The climax of this crisis came when Batman finally tracked Jason Todd to a remote warehouse in Bosnia, where his former partner had succeeded in capturing the Joker and was preparing to execute him according to the plan that had been developing for months. The confrontation between Batman and Robin in that abandoned building became a defining moment that would influence every subsequent decision Bruce Wayne made about involving other people in his mission. Jason's position in that warehouse was supported by evidence of the Joker's latest scheme, which had involved the systematic torture and murder of dozens of innocent victims, whose only crime had been being in the wrong place. When the Clown Prince of Crime decided to test new methods of psychological manipulation, the documentation that Jason had compiled demonstrated beyond doubt that the Joker's psychological condition was deteriorating in ways that made future rehabilitation impossible, while guaranteeing that his schemes would become increasingly destructive. Batman's argument against executing the Joker focused not on the villain's potential for redemption, but on the effect that killing would have on Jason's own psychological development. Bruce Wayne understood from personal experience how easily the desire for justice could become corrupted into something darker and more self-serving when heroes allowed themselves to cross moral lines that they had originally considered absolute. The standoff between Batman and Robin was complicated by the Joker's psychological manipulation of both heroes, as the villain recognized that the conflict between his captors could be exploited to serve his own purposes. The Clown Prince of Crime's running commentary on the philosophical debate between Batman and Robin revealed his sophisticated understanding of their psychological motivations, while demonstrating how he had orchestrated events to force exactly this kind of moral crisis. The resolution of the confrontation came not through rational argument or emotional appeal, but through a booby trap that the Joker had prepared as insurance against exactly this scenario. The explosion that followed was designed to kill everyone in the warehouse while making their deaths appear to be the result of the conflict between Batman and Robin rather than the Joker's final manipulation. When the smoke cleared, Bruce Wayne found himself alone among the rubble, with no trace of either Jason Todd or the Joker to suggest what had happened to them during those final moments. The possibility that both his former partner and his greatest enemy had perished in the explosion created a mixture of grief and relief that would haunt Batman for years to come, representing both the failure of his mission to save Jason and the potential end of the Joker's threat to innocent life. The aftermath of the warehouse incident forced Batman to confront fundamental questions about whether his mission was genuinely serving the cause of justice or simply perpetuating cycles of violence that consumed everyone who participated in them. The loss of Jason Todd represented not just personal tragedy but professional failure on a scale that threatened to undermine Batman's confidence in every aspect of his approach to crime fighting. The months following Jason Todd's disappearance marked the beginning of the darkest period in Batman's career, as Bruce Wayne struggled to maintain his mission while grappling with grief that threatened to consume his effectiveness as Gotham's protector. The loss of his second Robin represented more than personal tragedy. It signified the failure of his fundamental belief that trauma could be transformed into heroism through proper guidance and moral instruction. The realization that his influence on damaged young people was not automatically beneficial forced Bruce to question every aspect of his approach to fighting crime. Tim Drake entered Batman's life through circumstances that were both remarkable and troubling. The 13-year-old son of wealthy archaeologists had been present at Halley's circus on the night that Dick Grayson's parents were killed, and his exceptional memory had allowed him to recognize the distinctive acrobatic moves that Robin employed years later during televised coverage of a Batman operation. Tim's deductive reasoning led him to conclude that Dick Grayson was Robin, and from there to deduce that Bruce Wayne must be Batman. Rather than being satisfied with solving this mystery, Tim began conducting his own investigation into Batman's activities, tracking patterns in Bruce Wayne's public appearances and correlating them with Batman's operations throughout Gotham. The boy's detective work was sophisticated enough to map the entire structure of the Bat family's activities, including Barbara Gordon's role as Batgirl and Alfred Pennyworth's function as technical support coordinator. Tim's motivation for investigating Batman was not mere curiosity, but genuine concern about the psychological deterioration he observed in the Dark Knight's methods following Jason Todd's disappearance. The boy had noticed that Batman was becoming increasingly violent and reckless in his approach to criminals, suggesting that the loss of his partner was affecting his judgment in dangerous ways. Tim concluded that Batman needed a new Robin, not for operational reasons but for psychological stability. The presentation that Tim Drake made to Bruce Wayne regarding his deductions about the Bat family's identities was one of the most impressive displays of analytical reasoning that Bruce had ever encountered from someone so young. Tim's case files contained photographic evidence, timeline correlations, and behavioral analysis that would have impressed professional intelligence agencies. More importantly, his conclusions were accompanied by thoughtful recommendations for improving operational security and tactical effectiveness. Bruce Wayne's initial reaction to Tim's proposals was complicated by his continuing grief over Jason Todd's fate and his growing doubt about the wisdom of involving children in vigilante activities. The failure to save Jason from the psychological corruption that had ultimately led to his disappearance made Bruce reluctant to accept responsibility for another young person's moral development. Tim's obvious intelligence and dedication were impressive, but they also reminded Bruce of Jason's early promise and the devastating consequences of that potential being misdirected. Alfred Pennyworth's support for Tim Drake's recruitment proved decisive in convincing Bruce to accept the boy as the third Robin. The butler who had watched Jason Todd's psychological deterioration recognized in Tim a different kind of person, someone whose analytical nature and emotional stability might be better suited to the demands of partnership with Batman. Alfred's argument focused not on Tim's potential contributions to crime fighting, but on Batman's need for the kind of grounding influence that healthy relationships provided. Tim's training as Robin differed significantly from the crash course that Jason Todd had received, reflecting both Bruce Wayne's growing understanding of proper mentorship techniques and Tim's different personality and skill set. Where Jason had been driven by anger that needed to be channeled into constructive action, Tim was motivated by intellectual curiosity and genuine desire to help others. His approach to crime fighting emphasized detective work and strategic planning rather than the direct confrontation that had characterized Jason's methods. The partnership between Batman and the third Robin proved remarkably effective against criminal organizations that had grown accustomed to exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of their opponents. Tim's analytical approach to understanding criminal behavior complemented Batman's intuitive insights while providing fresh perspectives on cases that had seemed unsolvable. The combination of Bruce's experience and Tim's innovative thinking created a crime-fighting team that was more intellectually formidable than any previous iteration of the dynamic duo. But Gotham's criminal ecosystem had evolved during the period of Batman's isolation following Jason's disappearance, developing new forms of organization and methodology that presented unprecedented challenges to traditional vigilante approaches. The most significant of these developments was the rise of what criminologists termed hybrid organizations, criminal enterprises, that combined elements of traditional organized crime with the theatrical methods pioneered by costumed villains like the Joker and the Penguin. Roman Sionis, who operated under the criminal identity of Black Mask, represented the most successful example of this hybrid approach to organized crime. A former business executive whose legitimate enterprises had been destroyed through a combination of poor judgment and deliberate sabotage by competitors, Sionis had rebuilt his fortune through criminal activities that combined the disciplined hierarchy of traditional mob operations with the psychological warfare tactics employed by Arkham's most notorious inmates. Black Mask's criminal organization differed from conventional crime families in its systematic use of torture and terror as management tools, creating an atmosphere of fear that made betrayal or disloyalty virtually impossible among his subordinates. His methods included ritual scarring that marked his followers as permanent members of his organization while providing them with a sense of belonging that many had never experienced in legitimate society. The psychological bonds he created among his criminal followers proved more durable than the financial incentives that traditional organized crime relied upon. The false face society that Black Mask created became one of the most difficult criminal organizations that Batman had ever attempted to infiltrate or disrupt. Its members were bound together not just by mutual criminal activity, but by shared psychological trauma that Black Mask exploited to ensure absolute loyalty. The organization's structure was designed to survive the loss of individual leaders while maintaining operational effectiveness through collective decision-making processes that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to identify key figures for prosecution. Batman and Robin's investigation of the False Face Society revealed the extent to which Gotham's criminal landscape had evolved in response to years of vigilante pressure. Traditional methods of disrupting criminal organizations through arrest of leadership figures proved ineffective against groups that had deliberately adopted cellular structures designed to survive such attacks. The psychological bonds that held these new organizations together required different approaches that neither Batman nor law enforcement agencies were initially equipped to handle. The conflict with Black Mask also introduced Batman to new forms of criminal violence that exceeded even the Joker's capacity for inflicting psychological trauma on innocent victims. The False Face Society's initiation rituals involved forcing prospective members to commit acts of violence against random civilians, creating a population of criminals who were bound to the organization not just through loyalty, but through shared guilt that made leaving the group psychologically impossible. The investigation of these initiation crimes led Batman and Robin into neighborhoods of Gotham that had been effectively abandoned by legitimate authority, areas where the False Face Society operated with the confidence of a government rather than a criminal organization. The residents of these neighborhoods had learned to view Black Mask's followers as providing more reliable protection and dispute resolution than official law enforcement agencies, creating a parallel justice system that challenged Batman's assumptions about the relationship between criminals and communities. Tim Drake's analysis of the False Face Society's social structure revealed patterns that disturbed both him and Batman, suggesting that some criminal organizations were evolving beyond simple predatory relationships with their communities toward more complex arrangements that provided genuine benefits to residents while extracting tribute and loyalty. The realization that some of Gotham's citizens might actually prefer Black Mask's brutal but predictable rule to the chaos of competing criminal factions forced Batman to confront uncomfortable questions about the effectiveness of his mission. The psychological complexity of fighting criminals who genuinely believed they were providing necessary services to neglected communities created moral dilemmas that Batman's traditional framework for understanding justice could not adequately address. Black Mask's organization was undeniably criminal and violent, but it also provided structure and security in neighborhoods that legitimate authorities had effectively abandoned. The question of whether dismantling such organizations would ultimately help or harm the communities they controlled became one of the most challenging aspects of Batman's evolving mission. The crisis deepened when several members of the False Face Society turned out to be former victims of crimes that Batman had investigated but been unable to solve through conventional methods. These individuals had joined Black Mask's organization not through coercion or desperation, but through genuine belief that vigilante justice was more effective than the legal system at protecting vulnerable people from predatory behavior. Their testimonies forced Batman to acknowledge that his own methods might have inadvertently contributed to the appeal of more extreme approaches to crime fighting. The confrontation between Batman and Black Mask that concluded this phase of the investigation became one of the most psychologically complex battles that Bruce Wayne had ever fought. Roman Sionis possessed detailed knowledge of Batman's methods and psychological profile, having studied years of vigilante operations to develop countermeasures that exploited Batman's moral constraints and emotional vulnerabilities. The villain's understanding of Batman's need to protect innocent life allowed him to orchestrate situations where traditional heroic responses would result in greater harm than benefit to the communities involved. The resolution of the Black Mask crisis required Batman and Robin to develop new approaches to crime fighting that acknowledged the complex relationships between criminal organizations and the communities they operated within. The simple model of heroes fighting villains proved inadequate for addressing situations where criminal activity was intertwined with legitimate social needs that official institutions had failed to meet. The experience forced Batman to begin thinking about his mission in terms of social reform rather than simple law enforcement. The emergence of Bane in Gotham City represented a new category of threat that challenged every assumption Batman had developed about criminal psychology and tactical preparation. Unlike the theatrical villains who had previously plagued Gotham, Bane possessed both the intellectual capacity to understand Batman's methods and the physical capability to match or exceed the Dark Knight's combat effectiveness. His approach to destroying Batman was methodical and comprehensive, based on months of careful study rather than the impulsive schemes that characterized most costumed criminals. Bane had grown up in the prison of Peña Duro on the Caribbean island of Santa Prisca, where he had been forced to serve his father's life sentence from birth due to the corrupt justice system that governed the island nation. The harsh conditions of prison life had forged him into someone who viewed survival as the only meaningful goal, while his exceptional intelligence had allowed him to educate himself through whatever books and materials he could obtain from other inmates and occasional charitable donations. The experimental drug known as Venom had enhanced Bane's already formidable physical capabilities to superhuman levels, but it was his strategic thinking that made him truly dangerous to Batman's mission. Bane understood that Batman's effectiveness depended not just on his individual skills, but on his psychological state and the support network that allowed him to maintain his war on crime indefinitely. Rather than simply challenging Batman to direct combat, Bane developed a comprehensive plan to systematically destroy every foundation of the Dark Knight's life. The first phase of Bane's assault on Batman involved orchestrating a massive breakout from Arkham Asylum that released every dangerous criminal who had been captured and imprisoned over the years. The Joker, Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, Two-Face, and dozens of other threats were suddenly loose in Gotham simultaneously, creating a crisis that would require Batman to exhaust himself by fighting multiple enemies in rapid succession without adequate rest or recovery time. The psychological impact of seeing years of work undone in a single night was exactly what Bane had calculated would undermine Batman's confidence, while forcing him into a reactive rather than strategic approach to crime fighting. Batman found himself racing from crisis to crisis, preventing immediate disasters while being unable to develop long-term solutions to the chaos that had been unleashed throughout his city. The pattern continued for weeks, with each captured villain being replaced by another who had escaped during the confusion. Tim Drake and Barbara Gordon worked around the clock to support Batman's efforts to recapture the escaped criminals, but even their combined resources proved insufficient to handle the scale of criminal activity that Bane's plan had unleashed. The Batcave became a command center for coordinating responses to simultaneous emergencies across Gotham, with Tim analyzing patterns in the criminal activities, while Barbara maintained communication with Commissioner Gordon and other law enforcement allies. Alfred watched with growing concern as Bruce Wayne pushed himself beyond normal human endurance, operating on minimal sleep while sustaining injuries that would have hospitalized ordinary people. The butler, who had raised Bruce from childhood, recognized that Batman was approaching physical and psychological limits that could result in mistakes severe enough to get him killed during routine operations that he would normally handle easily. The toll that Bane's campaign was taking on Batman became apparent to everyone who worked with him, but Bruce Wayne's stubborn determination to handle every crisis personally prevented him from accepting the help that might have allowed him to maintain his effectiveness. His insistence on being personally involved in every major operation reflected both his sense of responsibility for Gotham's welfare and his psychological need to maintain control over situations that reminded him of his parents' death. Bane's patient observation of Batman's deteriorating condition allowed him to time the final phase of his plan perfectly. When Batman was at his most exhausted and psychologically vulnerable, Bane revealed himself as the architect of Gotham's recent chaos while challenging the Dark Knight to single combat in Wayne Manor itself. The location was chosen deliberately to force Batman to defend his most personal space while being too weakened to mount an effective response. The fight between Batman and Bane in Wayne Manor's library became one of the most brutal physical confrontations in the history of Batman's career. Bane's venom-enhanced strength allowed him to overpower Batman's combat techniques through sheer physical superiority, while his strategic intelligence prevented Batman from exploiting the tactical advantages that usually allowed him to defeat stronger opponents. The battle was not simply a contest of fighting skills, but a systematic dismantling of Batman's belief in his own invincibility. The moment when Bane lifted Batman above his head and brought him down across his knee, breaking Bruce Wayne's spine, represented more than physical injury. It was the symbolic destruction of Batman's myth of invulnerability, proof that even the Dark Knight could be broken by someone who understood his weaknesses and planned accordingly. The sound of Bruce Wayne's vertebrae snapping echoed through Wayne Manor like the gunshots that had killed his parents decades earlier, marking another moment when his world was fundamentally changed by violence. Alfred's desperate efforts to save Bruce Wayne's life following the confrontation with Bane required calling upon medical contacts who could provide treatment without reporting the injuries to authorities who might investigate their cause. The spinal damage was severe enough that conventional medical opinion suggested Bruce might never walk again, much less continue his physically demanding career as Batman. The realization that his mission might be permanently ended by his injuries forced Bruce to confront questions about identity and purpose that he had been avoiding throughout his adult life. The period of Bruce Wayne's recovery became one of the most psychologically challenging phases of his entire life, as he struggled with depression and despair while watching Gotham suffer under Bane's rule. Tim Drake and Barbara Gordon attempted to maintain some level of vigilante activity, but they lacked both the resources and the psychological presence that Batman brought to crime fighting. Gotham's criminals quickly recognized that the Dark Knight was no longer protecting their city, leading to an explosion of criminal activity that overwhelmed law enforcement capabilities. Jean-Paul Valley's transformation into a replacement Batman during Bruce Wayne's recovery represented both the salvation and corruption of everything Batman's mission was supposed to represent. Valley possessed the physical capabilities and psychological drive necessary to challenge Bane's control over Gotham, but his background in the Order of St. Dumas had instilled religious beliefs about justice that were fundamentally incompatible with Bruce Wayne's humanistic approach to heroism. The Azrael persona that influenced Jean-Paul Valley's interpretation of the Batman role emphasized divine judgment and purification through violence, rather than the protection of innocent life that had motivated Bruce Wayne's original mission. Valley's methods were undeniably effective against criminals who had grown comfortable operating without fear of consequences, but they also transformed Batman from a symbol of hope into an agent of terror who inspired fear in honest citizens as well as criminals. The new Batman's willingness to use lethal force against criminals who threatened innocent life represented everything that Bruce Wayne had tried to avoid during his own career as Gotham's protector. Valley's argument that some criminals deserved death rather than imprisonment echoed the same philosophical positions that had driven Jason Todd toward increasingly violent methods, suggesting that the corrupting influence of vigilante justice might be unavoidable for anyone who embraced the mission completely. Commissioner Gordon's growing discomfort with the new Batman's methods reflected broader concerns throughout Gotham's law enforcement community, about the direction that vigilante justice was taking under Jean-Paul Valley's leadership. The partnership between police and Batman that had developed during Bruce Wayne's years as the Dark Knight began to deteriorate, as Valley's interpretation of justice conflicted with legal and ethical standards that even corrupt officials found difficult to ignore. The crisis of legitimacy that surrounded Valley's tenure as Batman forced Bruce Wayne to acknowledge that his mission was larger than any individual who might wear the cape and cowl. The symbol that he had created to inspire fear in criminals had taken on a life of its own, becoming something that could be corrupted or misdirected by anyone with sufficient determination and misguided sense of purpose. The realization that Batman could become a force for evil rather than good provided additional motivation for Bruce's rehabilitation efforts. The physical therapy and training that Bruce Wayne underwent to recover from his spinal injuries required him to rebuild not just his body, but his understanding of his own limitations and capabilities. The process was both humbling and educational, forcing him to acknowledge that his previous approach to crime fighting had been unsustainable and potentially counterproductive in ways that he had refused to recognize, while he was still physically capable of overwhelming most opponents through superior preparation and execution. The psychological journey that accompanied Bruce Wayne's physical recovery involved confronting fears about inadequacy and mortality that he had been suppressing since childhood. The possibility that he might never again be capable of protecting Gotham as Batman forced him to consider alternative approaches to his mission that did not depend solely on his personal capabilities as a vigilante. The experience of helplessness during his injury taught him lessons about vulnerability and interdependence that would influence every subsequent decision he made about involving others in his war on crime. The confrontation between Bruce Wayne and Jean-Paul Valley for control of the Batman identity became a battle for the soul of the mission that had defined both their lives. Valley's religious conviction that he was divinely chosen to serve as Batman's successor conflicted with Bruce's belief that the symbol belonged to whoever could use it most effectively to protect innocent life. The philosophical debate between them revealed fundamental differences in their understanding of justice, heroism, and the obligations that came with extraordinary power and capability. The reclaiming of the Batman mantle from Jean-Paul Valley marked the beginning of a new chapter in Bruce Wayne's understanding of his mission, one that acknowledged both his physical limitations and the broader responsibilities that came with having created a symbol larger than any individual who might wear it. The months spent recovering from his injuries had forced Bruce to confront uncomfortable truths about the unsustainable nature of his previous approach to crime fighting. While Valley's tenure as Batman had demonstrated how easily the symbol could be corrupted by someone with different philosophical commitments, the process of proving himself worthy to resume the Batman identity required Bruce Wayne to rebuild not just his physical capabilities, but his entire strategic approach to protecting Gotham. The spinal injury that Bane had inflicted would never fully heal, leaving Bruce with permanent limitations that required him to rely more heavily on intelligence, technology, and allies, rather than the overwhelming physical superiority that had characterized his earlier career. The adjustment was both humbling and liberating, forcing him to develop new methods while relieving him of the psychological pressure to handle every crisis through personal intervention. Dick Grayson's return to Gotham during this transitional period provided Bruce with both emotional support and practical assistance in re-establishing effective vigilante operations. The original Robin had evolved into Nightwing, developing his own approach to heroism that combined the acrobatic skills of his circus background with detective training learned from Batman and leadership experience gained through his work with the Teen Titans. Dick's perspective on Bruce's mission was shaped by years of independence, giving him insights into the strengths and weaknesses of Batman's methods that Bruce himself had been unable to recognize. The partnership between Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson during the period of reclaiming the Batman identity was characterized by a more equal distribution of responsibilities than their original mentor-student relationship had allowed. Dick's willingness to challenge Bruce's tactical decisions and strategic priorities forced Batman to articulate and defend choices that he had previously made through intuition rather than careful analysis. The process improved both their effectiveness as crime fighters and their relationship as family members who had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting others. Tim Drake's role as Robin evolved significantly during this period, as Bruce Wayne's recognition of his own limitations led him to grant his third partner greater autonomy and responsibility than either Dick Grayson or Jason Todd had enjoyed during their early careers. Tim's analytical approach to detective work complemented Bruce's intuitive insights while providing independent verification of conclusions that might have been influenced by unconscious bias or wishful thinking. The partnership became genuinely collaborative in ways that previous iterations of Batman and Robin had never achieved. The technological upgrades to Batman's equipment and vehicles during this period reflected both his physical limitations and his growing understanding that effective crime fighting required capabilities that exceeded what any individual could provide. The new Batcave incorporated advanced computer systems that could analyze criminal patterns across multiple jurisdictions while maintaining secure communications with law enforcement agencies and allied heroes. The Batmobile was redesigned to function as a mobile command center rather than simply a high-performance vehicle, acknowledging that modern crime fighting required information processing capabilities as much as speed and armor. Barbara Gordon's evolution from Batgirl to Oracle represented one of the most significant developments in the expansion of Batman's mission during this period. The spinal injury that had ended her career as a physical crime fighter had not diminished her commitment to protecting Gotham, but it had forced her to develop new methods of contributing to vigilante activities. Her transformation into an information broker and tactical coordinator created capabilities that enhanced the effectiveness of every hero who worked with her while establishing new models for how disabled individuals could contribute to missions that seemed to require perfect physical condition. The Oracle identity that Barbara Gordon created became the central nervous system for a network of heroes and law enforcement professionals who shared intelligence and coordinated responses to threats that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Her ability to access and analyze information from sources throughout the world gave Batman's mission a scope and sophistication that had never been possible when he operated primarily within Gotham's boundaries. The partnership between Batman and Oracle demonstrated how technology could amplify human capabilities in ways that made individuals more effective rather than simply replacing them with automated systems. The emergence of new criminal organizations during this period reflected the broader changes in Gotham's social and economic landscape that had occurred during Batman's absence. The power vacuum created by Bane's defeat and the chaos of Valley's violent tenure as Batman had been filled by criminal enterprises that combined traditional organized crime methods with technological sophistication and international connections that exceeded anything Carmine Falcone's generation had achieved. The appearance of the ventriloquist and his dummy Mr. Scarface represented a new category of criminal that challenged Batman's understanding of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Arnold Wesker appeared to be a meek, harmless individual whose criminal activities were controlled by his ventriloquist dummy, but psychological evaluation revealed a dissociative identity disorder so complete that Wesker genuinely believed Mr. Scarface was an independent entity making decisions about criminal activities. The question of whether Wesker could be held responsible for crimes committed while under the influence of his alternate personality created legal and ethical dilemmas that the criminal justice system was not equipped to handle. The investigation of the ventriloquist's crimes required Batman to work closely with mental health professionals who could provide insights into dissociative disorders that went beyond his own knowledge of criminal psychology. The collaboration between Batman and psychiatrists like Dr. Sarah Essen Gordon represented a new approach to understanding and treating criminals whose conditions fell outside the scope of conventional law enforcement or vigilante methods. The recognition that some criminal behavior resulted from mental illness that required medical treatment rather than punishment or intimidation marked a significant evolution in Batman's philosophy. The return of Harvey Dent as Two-Face during this period provided Batman with an opportunity to test new approaches to rehabilitation and treatment that emphasized therapy and medical intervention rather than simple incarceration. Bruce Wayne's friendship with Harvey Dent prior to the acid attack that had created the Two-Face persona gave him personal motivation to attempt rehabilitation efforts that might have seemed impractical for other criminals. The process required Batman to work with medical professionals and social workers whose expertise complemented his own skills, while addressing aspects of Harvey's condition that vigilante methods alone could never treat. The partial success of Harvey Dent's rehabilitation demonstrated both the potential and limitations of Batman's evolving approach to criminal justice. Therapy and medication could control the worst symptoms of Two-Face's dissociative disorder, but they could not completely eliminate the psychological damage that had been caused by physical trauma and years of criminal activity. Harvey's periodic relapses into the Two-Face persona served as reminders that mental illness was an ongoing condition rather than a problem that could be solved through heroic intervention. The expansion of the Bat family during this period to include additional allies like Azrael, the Spoiler, and eventually Cassandra Cain as the new Batgirl reflected Bruce Wayne's growing recognition that his mission required diverse skills and perspectives that no individual could provide. Each new member brought unique capabilities and viewpoints that enhanced the team's effectiveness while creating new challenges for coordination and leadership. The process of integrating multiple heroes with different backgrounds and motivations required Batman to develop management skills that went beyond his original conception of crime fighting as a primarily solitary activity. Stephanie Brown's emergence as the Spoiler represented a different model of vigilante development than the mentorship relationships that had characterized Batman's previous partnerships. Stephanie had begun fighting crime independently to oppose her father's criminal activities as the Clue Master, developing her own methods and moral code before ever encountering Batman. Her integration into the Bat family required negotiations and compromises rather than the training and indoctrination that had shaped Dick Grayson, Jason Todd, and Tim Drake's development as heroes. The challenges of managing an expanded team of vigilantes with different personalities, capabilities, and philosophical commitments forced Batman to acknowledge that his original vision of a solitary crusader had evolved into something more resembling a military organization or law enforcement agency. The responsibilities of leadership required skills in personnel management, strategic planning, and political coordination that Bruce Wayne had never expected to need when he first donned the cape and cowl years earlier. The success of these expanded operations against increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations demonstrated the effectiveness of collaborative approaches to crime fighting, but it also created new vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. The larger the Bat family became, the more potential targets criminals could threaten in order to manipulate Batman's behavior. The recognition that protecting his allies might sometimes conflict with protecting innocent civilians created moral dilemmas that Bruce had never faced during his years as a primarily independent operator. The transformation of Batman's mission from a personal crusade into an institutional force for justice had consequences that extended far beyond Gotham's boundaries, inspiring heroes throughout the world, while establishing precedents that would influence law enforcement and vigilante activities for generations to come. The no-kill rule that Bruce Wayne had maintained throughout his career became a defining principle of modern heroism, distinguishing legitimate protectors of innocent life from vigilantes who had allowed their missions to be corrupted by vengeance or personal agenda. The philosophical framework that Batman had developed over decades of crime fighting provided a model for how extraordinary individuals could use their capabilities to serve society without becoming threats to the democratic institutions they claimed to protect. The careful balance between effectiveness and restraint that characterized Batman's methods demonstrated that heroes could be powerful enough to handle threats that conventional law enforcement could not manage while remaining accountable to moral principles that prevented them from becoming authoritarian forces themselves. The influence of Batman's example on other heroes was visible in the emergence of vigilantes throughout the country, who adopted similar codes of conduct and operational methods. The techniques that Bruce Wayne had pioneered for gathering intelligence, coordinating with law enforcement, and maintaining cover identities became standard practices for heroes who wanted to operate effectively without compromising their principles or endangering the communities they served. The technological innovations developed for Batman's mission were adapted by other heroes whose different capabilities and circumstances required modified approaches to crime fighting. The Oracle network that Barbara Gordon had created evolved into a global information sharing system that connected heroes, law enforcement agencies, and intelligence organizations in ways that had never been possible before modern communication technology. Her ability to coordinate responses to international threats while maintaining the security and anonymity of individual operatives created new possibilities for cooperative law enforcement that transcended traditional jurisdictional boundaries. The success of these collaborative efforts demonstrated that modern crime fighting required capabilities that exceeded what any individual hero or agency could provide independently. The Bat family's approach to training and mentoring young heroes established standards for how experienced vigilantes should handle the responsibility of involving others in dangerous activities. The careful balance between providing adequate preparation and avoiding the psychological damage that could result from premature exposure to violence became a model that other hero organizations adopted when developing their own mentorship programs. The recognition that trauma could be channeled into heroism but only through proper guidance and emotional support influenced how veteran heroes approached relationships with younger colleagues throughout the superhero community. The psychological studies that emerged from Batman's career provided insights into the mental health challenges that affected individuals who dedicated their lives to fighting crime and protecting others. The research conducted by mental health professionals who worked with the Bat family revealed patterns of stress, isolation, and identity confusion that were common among people who maintained dual identities while engaging in high-stress activities. These findings led to the development of support systems and therapeutic approaches specifically designed for heroes whose unique circumstances required specialized understanding and treatment. The legal precedents established through Batman's cooperation with law enforcement agencies created new frameworks for how vigilante activities could be integrated with official criminal justice procedures. The intelligence that Batman provided to prosecutors and police departments had to be obtained and presented in ways that would be admissible in court while protecting the sources and methods that made such information gathering possible. The collaboration between Batman and legal professionals like District Attorney Harvey Dent established procedures that other jurisdictions adapted when dealing with heroes who operated outside traditional law enforcement structures. The technological innovations developed for Batman's mission had applications that extended far beyond crime fighting, influencing advances in fields ranging from materials science to computer programming. The armor, vehicles, and surveillance equipment created for vigilante operations incorporated cutting-edge research that later found commercial and military applications. The Wayne Enterprises research and development programs that supported Batman's activities became sources of technological advancement that benefited society in ways that had nothing to do with criminal justice or heroic activities. The economic impact of Batman's mission on Gotham City was substantial and complex, involving both the direct costs of vigilante operations and the broader effects of reduced crime rates on business development and quality of life. The Wayne Foundation's charitable activities were coordinated with Batman's crime-fighting efforts in ways that addressed underlying social problems that contributed to criminal behavior. The integrated approach to urban renewal that combined law enforcement with economic development and social services created a model that other cities studied when developing their own anti-crime strategies. The influence that Batman's career had on popular culture and public perception of heroism was profound and lasting, establishing archetypes and expectations that shaped how subsequent generations understood the relationship between individual capability and social responsibility. The image of the lone hero fighting injustice while maintaining strict moral principles became a standard against which other heroes were measured, creating both inspiration and pressure for individuals who possessed extraordinary abilities or resources. The international recognition of Batman's methods and effectiveness led to formal and informal consultation relationships with law enforcement and intelligence agencies around the world. The techniques that Bruce Wayne had developed for understanding criminal psychology and predicting criminal behavior were studied and adapted by professionals whose responsibilities included counter-terrorism, organized crime investigation, and threat assessment. The influence of Batman's analytical methods extended into academic research on criminal justice and behavioral psychology. The impact that Batman's career had on Gotham's criminal justice system was transformative, creating new approaches to rehabilitation and treatment that emphasized understanding the psychological and social factors that contributed to criminal behavior. The collaboration between Batman and mental health professionals in treating criminals like Harvey Dent and Arnold Wesker established precedents for therapeutic interventions that went beyond simple punishment or incarceration. The recognition that some criminal behavior resulted from mental illness or trauma rather than moral failing led to reforms in how the justice system approached sentencing and treatment. The emergence of the next generation of heroes who were inspired by Batman's example demonstrated the lasting impact of his mission on individuals who had grown up knowing that ordinary people could choose to dedicate their lives to protecting others. Young heroes like Tim Drake and later Damian Wayne represented different approaches to continuing Batman's legacy while adapting his methods to changing circumstances and new threats. The evolution of the Bat family into a multi-generational organization suggested that the mission Bruce Wayne had begun would continue long after his own career ended. The philosophical questions raised by Batman's career about the relationship between power and responsibility continued to influence discussions about heroism and social justice long after the specific crimes he had fought were forgotten. The example of someone who had every advantage that wealth and privilege could provide, choosing to risk his life repeatedly for the benefit of strangers, established a standard of moral obligation that challenged others who possessed extraordinary capabilities to consider how they might use those gifts in service of others. The legacy institutions that emerged from Batman's mission, including the charitable organizations, research foundations, and training programs associated with Wayne Enterprises and the Wayne Foundation, ensured that the positive impact of his career would continue even if vigilante activities eventually ceased. The integration of crime fighting with broader social reform efforts created sustainable approaches to urban improvement that did not depend entirely on the continued presence of costumed heroes. The recognition that Batman's mission had evolved from personal vengeance into institutional social reform marked the complete transformation of Bruce Wayne from a traumatized child seeking to prevent others from experiencing his pain into a mature leader whose influence extended far beyond any individual criminal he had fought or victim he had saved. The boy who had sworn an oath at his parents' graves had become something larger than he had ever imagined possible, creating changes in the world that would outlast any individual life or career. As our long night watch through the shadows of Gotham draws to its close, we find ourselves contemplating questions that stretch far beyond any single hero's journey, mysteries that will echo through generations yet to come. The boy who knelt at his parents' graves and swore an impossible oath has become something larger than Bruce Wayne ever imagined, creating ripples that extend through time in ways that challenge our understanding of what one person can accomplish when they refuse to surrender to despair. The emergence of Damian Wayne, Bruce's son with Talia al Ghul, represents both the continuation and potential corruption of the Batman legacy. Trained from birth by the League of Assassins to be the perfect weapon, Damian embodies the eternal question of whether heroism is learned or inherited, whether the principles that guided Bruce Wayne's mission can survive transmission to someone whose earliest memories involve death and violence rather than love and loss. The boy who carries both Wayne and Al Ghul blood within his veins stands at the crossroads between redemption and damnation, his future dependent on choices that will determine whether Batman's legacy inspires salvation or creates another generation of warriors too damaged to find peace. The Court of Owls, that ancient secret society that has manipulated Gotham's development since before the Wayne family first arrived in the New World, reminds us that some mysteries run deeper than any individual hero's understanding. Their revelation that Batman had been fighting street crime while remaining ignorant of the true powers that shaped his city's destiny suggests that even the world's greatest detective has limitations, that knowledge and preparation cannot protect against enemies who have been planning their schemes for centuries rather than years. The question of whether Batman's mission has truly made Gotham safer or simply changed the nature of its dangers haunts every victory he has achieved. The theatrical criminals who emerged in response to his presence have killed more people than conventional crime ever did, while the escalation of criminal methods in response to vigilante pressure has created threats that would never have existed without Batman's intervention. The Joker alone represents a force of destruction that might never have been unleashed if Bruce Wayne had chosen different methods of honoring his parents' memory. Yet the alternative history where Batman never existed suggests outcomes even darker than the chaos his presence has sometimes created. Without the symbol of hope that Batman represents, without the proof that ordinary people can choose to fight back against injustice, Gotham might have surrendered completely to the corruption that had been consuming it long before Bruce Wayne was born. The organized crime families, the corrupt politicians, the predators who thrived in urban decay, might have created a city where suffering was so normalized that no one even remembered what justice looked like. The technological innovations that emerged from Batman's mission continue to influence human development in ways that extend far beyond crime fighting. The materials science advances that created better body armor have improved safety equipment for emergency responders worldwide. The computer systems designed to analyze criminal patterns have found applications in medical research and disaster response. The psychological insights gained from studying Gotham's unique criminal population have advanced understanding of mental health treatment and rehabilitation techniques. The philosophical framework that Batman established for heroic action has become a template that influences how society expects extraordinary individuals to use their capabilities. The principle that great power must be tempered by great restraint, that heroes must hold themselves to higher moral standards than the enemies they fight, has become embedded in cultural expectations about what separates legitimate protectors from dangerous vigilantes. The question of succession haunts every consideration of Batman's legacy. Dick Grayson has proven capable of wearing the mantle temporarily, but his evolution into Nightwing suggests that the Batman identity requires something more than competence or good intentions. Tim Drake possesses the analytical skills and moral grounding to continue the mission, but lacks the driving obsession that has sustained Bruce Wayne through decades of sacrifice and isolation. Damian Wayne has the Wayne family genetics and extensive training, but his violent upbringing may have corrupted his understanding of justice in ways that make him unsuitable for the responsibility. The possibility that Batman's mission might require the specific psychological profile created by Bruce Wayne's childhood trauma raises uncomfortable questions about whether heroism sometimes depends on damage that healthy individuals cannot replicate. The idea that saving Gotham might require someone willing to sacrifice their own happiness and mental health suggests that the city's problems run too deep for conventional solutions, that only someone broken in particular ways can understand and address the unique forms of corruption that flourish in urban environments. The international expansion of Batman's influence through Batman Incorporated demonstrates both the potential and the dangers of institutionalizing vigilante justice. Heroes inspired by Batman's example have emerged in cities worldwide, adapting his methods to different cultural contexts and criminal threats. But the question of quality control, of ensuring that individuals wearing bat symbols actually serve the cause of justice rather than personal agenda, remains problematic in ways that Bruce Wayne has never adequately addressed. The emergence of the Batman Beyond timeline, where an aging Bruce Wayne mentors teenager Terry McGinnis in a future Gotham, suggests that the mission might be eternal in ways that transcend any individual's lifespan. The technology that sustains future Batman operations represents the logical evolution of tools that Bruce Wayne began developing decades earlier, while the continuing presence of familiar criminal organizations suggests that some forms of evil adapt and survive regardless of how many heroes fight against them. The question of whether Batman's war on crime can ever actually be won haunts every tactical victory he achieves. Arkham Asylum continues to house criminals who escape with predictable regularity, suggesting that the revolving door of justice might be an inherent feature rather than a correctable flaw. The emergence of new criminals to replace those who are captured or killed indicates that Gotham's problems might be systemic rather than individual, requiring social reform approaches that go beyond what any vigilante can provide. The psychological cost of Batman's mission extends beyond Bruce Wayne himself to everyone who has been touched by his crusade. Alfred's loyalty has required him to watch someone he loves destroy himself through heroic sacrifice. Dick Grayson's childhood was consumed by training that prepared him for a war that might never end. Jason Todd's death and resurrection created trauma that continues to influence his relationships and choices. The question of whether these sacrifices are justified by the lives saved and crimes prevented remains open to debate. The influence of Batman's example on law enforcement agencies worldwide demonstrates that conventional institutions can be improved through exposure to more effective methods, but also suggests that legitimate authority requires the kind of accountability that vigilante justice deliberately avoids. The techniques that Batman pioneered for understanding criminal psychology have been adopted by police departments and intelligence agencies, but always within legal frameworks that constrain how such knowledge can be applied. The mystery of what Batman might become if he ever achieved complete victory over crime in Gotham raises questions about whether his mission serves the city or serves his own psychological needs. The possibility that Bruce Wayne might be addicted to the conflict and validation that fighting crime provides suggests that perfect success could be as psychologically devastating as complete failure. The question of what purpose his life would serve in a world without injustice to fight challenges assumptions about the relationship between heroism and personal fulfillment. As dawn approaches over Gotham City, as our long night of storytelling draws to its natural close, we are left with the same questions that have haunted Bruce Wayne since the night his parents died in Crime Alley. Can one person really make a difference in a world full of cruelty and corruption? Can the desire to help others remain pure when it requires choices that damage the helper? Can justice be achieved through methods that sometimes resemble the very crimes they're meant to prevent? The boy who swore an oath at his parents' graves has spent his entire adult life searching for answers to these questions, creating a legacy that will continue long after Bruce Wayne's story ends. Whether that legacy represents humanity at its best, or trauma transformed into something beautiful, but ultimately unsustainable, remains a mystery that each new generation must solve for themselves. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember that someone watches over every city, every street, every innocent soul who needs protection from the darkness. The bat signal may not shine in your sky, but the promise it represents, the commitment that good will always rise to meet evil, that hope will always answer despair, that light exists even in the deepest shadows, that promise never fades. Sweet dreams, knowing that guardians watch over us all, and that the greatest heroes are often those who fight not because they enjoy the battle, but because someone must stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. The night may be long, and the watch may be eternal, but as long as there are those willing to take up the cowl when darkness falls, the dawn will always come.